Chapter 15, Part 3 of The Sea. Its Stirring Story of Adventure, Peril, and Heroism, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Sea. Its Stirring Story of Adventure, Peril, and Heroism, Volume 1, by Frederick WHYMPER. Chapter 15. The History of Ships and Shipping Interests, Part 3. When the king had determined in 1415 to land an army in France, he hired ships from Holland, Zealand, and Friesland, his own naval means not being sufficient for the transport. Among his other preparations, requisite for so high an enterprise, boats covered with leather for the passage of rivers are mentioned. His fleet consisted of 1,000 sail, and it left Southampton on Sunday, the 11th of August of the above-mentioned year. When the ships had passed the Isle of Wight, swans were seen swimming in the midst of the fleet, which was hailed as a happy auspice. Henry anchored on the following Tuesday at the mouth of the Seine, about 3 miles from Harfleur. A council of the captains was summoned, and an order issued that no one, under pain of death, should land before the king, but that all should be in readiness to go ashore the next morning. This was done, and the bulk of the army, stated to have comprised 24,000 archers and 6,000 men of arms, was landed in small vessels, boats, and skiffs, taking up a position on the hill nearest to Harfleur. The moment Henry landed, he fell on his knees and implored the divine aid and protection to lead him on to victory, then conferring knighthood on many of his followers. At the entrance of the port, a chain had been stretched between 2 large, well-armed towers, while it was farther protected by stakes and trunks of trees to prevent the vessels from approaching. During the siege, which lasted 36 days, the fleet blockaded the port, and at its conclusion, Henry, flushed with a victory which is said to have cost the English only 1,600 and the enemy 10,000 lives, determined to march his army through France to Calais. It was on this march that he won the glorious Battle of Agincourt. On the 16th of November, he embarked for Dover, reaching that port the same day. Here a magnificent ovation awaited him. The burgesses rushed into the sea and bore him ashore on their shoulders. The whole population was intoxicated with delight. One chronicler states that the passage across had been extremely boisterous, and that the French noblemen suffered so much from seasickness that they considered the trip worse than the very battles themselves in which they had been taken prisoners. When Henry arrived near London, a great concourse of people met him at Blackheath, and he, as one remembering from whom all victories are sent, would not allow his helmet to be carried before him, whereupon the people might have seen the blows and dents that he had received. Neither would he suffer any ditties to be made and sung by minstrels of his glorious victory, for that he would have the praise and thanks altogether given to God. Next year the French attempted to retake Harfleur. Henry sent a fleet of 400 sail to the rescue, under his brother John, Duke of Bedford, the upshot being that almost the whole French fleet, to the number of 500 ships, hulks, carracks, and small vessels, were taken or sunk. The English vessels remained becalmed in the roadstead for 3 weeks afterwards. Southey, who has collated all the best authorities in his admirable naval work, says the bodies which had been thrown overboard in the action, or sunk in the enemy's ships, rose and floated above them in great numbers, and the English may have deemed it a relief from the contemplation of that ghastly sight to be kept upon the alert by some galleys which, taking advantage of the calm, ventured as near them as they dare by day and night, and endeavored to burn the ships with wildfire. He adds that the first mention of wildfire he had found is by Harding, one of the earliest of our poets, in the following passage referring to this event. With oars many about us did they wind, with wildfire oft assailed us day and night, to brenn our ships in it that they could or might. Next year we read of Henry's preparing to again attack France. The enemy had increased their naval force by hiring a number of Genoese and other Italian vessels. The king sent a preliminary force against them under his kinsman, the Earl of Huntingdon, who, near the mouth of the Seine, succeeded in sinking 3 and capturing 3 of the great Genoese carracks, taking the Admiral Jacques, the bastard of Bourbon, and as much money as would have been half a year's pay for the whole fleet. These prizes were brought to Southampton, from whence the king shortly set forth with a fleet of 1,500 ships, the sails of his own vessel being of purple silk richly embroidered with gold. The remainder of Henry's brief reign, for he died the same year, is but the history of a series of successes over his enemies. It must never be forgotten that the navies of our early history were not permanently organized, but drawn from all sources. A noble, a city or port, voluntarily or otherwise, contributed according to the exigencies of the occasion. As we shall see, it is to Henry VIII that we owe the establishment of a royal navy as a permanent institution. In 1546, King Henry's vessels are classified according to their quality, thus ships, galleasses, pinnaces, row barges. A list bearing date in 1612 exhibits the classes as follows: ships royal, measuring downwards from 1,200 to 800 tons, middling ships from 800 to 600 tons, small ships 350 tons, and pinnaces from 200 to 80 tons. According to the old definition, a ship was defined to be a large hollow building made to pass over the seas with sails, without reference to size or quality. Before the days of the Great Harry, few, if any, English ships had more than one mast or one sail. The ship had 3 masts, and the Henry Grady do, which supplanted her, 4. The galleass were probably a long, low, and sharp-built vessel, propelled by oars as well as by sails, the latter probably not fixed to the mast or any standing yard, but hoisted from the deck when required to be used, as in the lugger or felucca of modern days. The pinnace was a smaller description of galleass, while the row barge is sufficiently explained by its title. The history of the period following the reign of Henry V has much to do with shipping interests of all kinds. The constant wars and turbulent times gave great opportunity for piracy in the Channel and on the high seas. Thus we read of Hannekin Lou, an outlaw from Ghent, who had so prospered in piratical enterprises that he got together a squadron of 8 or 10 vessels well armed and stored. He not only infested the coast of Flanders and Holland and the English Channel, but scoured the coasts of Spain as far as Gibraltar, making impartial war on any or all nations and styling himself the friend of God and the enemy of all mankind. This pirate escaped the vengeance of man, but at length was punished by the elements. The greater part of his people perished in a storm, and Hannekin Lou disappeared from the scene. Shortly afterwards we find the Hollanders and Zealanders uniting their forces against the Easterling pirates, then infesting the seas and taking 20 of their ships. This action, says Southey, was more important in its consequences than in itself. It made the 2 provinces sensible, for the first time, of their maritime strength, and gave a new impulse to that spirit of maritime adventure which they had recently begun to manifest. Previously, a voyage to Spain had been regarded as so perilous that whoever undertook it settled his worldly and his spiritual affairs as if preparing for death before he set forth, while now they opened up a brisk trade with that country and Portugal. Till now they had been compelled to bear the insults and injuries of the Easterlings without combined attempt at defense. Now they retaliated, captured one of their admirals on the coast of Norway, and hoisted a besom at the masthead in token that they had swept the seas clean from their pirate enemies. And now, in turn, some of them became pirates themselves, more particularly Hendrik von Borselen, Lord of Veer, who assembled all the outlaws he could gather, and committed such depredations that he was enabled to add greatly to his possessions in Walcheren by the purchase of confiscated estates. He received others as grants from his own duke, who feared him, and thought it prudent at any cost to retain, at least in nominal obedience, one who might render himself so obnoxious an enemy. This did not prevent the admiral, for he held that rank under the duke, from infesting the coast of Flanders, carrying off cattle from Cadsand and selling them publicly in Zeeland. His excuse was that the terrible character of his men compelled him to act as he did, and the duke admitted the exculpation, being fain to overlook outrages which he could neither prevent nor punish. A statute of the reign of Henry VI sets forth the robberies committed upon the poor merchants of this realm, not merely on the sea, but even in the rivers and ports of Britain, and how not merely they lost their goods, but their persons also were taken and imprisoned. Nor was this all, for the king's poor subjects dwelling nigh the sea-coasts were taken out of their own houses with their chattels and children and carried by the enemies where it pleased them. In consequence, the commons begged that an armament might be provided and maintained on the sea, which was conceded, and for a time piracy on English subjects was partially quashed. Meantime we had pirates of our own. Warwick, the kingmaker, was unscrupulous at all points, and cared nothing for the lawfulness of the captures which he could make on the high seas. For example, when he left England for the purpose of securing Calais, then belonging to England, and the fleet for the House of York, he, having 14 well-appointed vessels, fell in with a fleet of Spaniards and Genoese. There was a very sore and long-continued battle fought betwixt them, lasting almost 2 days. The English lost 100 men. One account speaks of the Spanish and Genoese loss at 1,000 men killed, and another of 26 vessels sunk or put to flight. It is certain that 3 of the largest vessels were taken into Calais, laden with wine, oil, iron, wax, cloth of gold, and other riches, in all amounting in value to no less than 10,000 pounds. The Earl was a favorite with the sailors, probably for the license he gave them, when the Duke of Somerset was appointed by the king's party to the command of Calais, from which he was effectually shut out by Warwick. They carried off some of his ships and deserted with them to the latter. Not long after, when reinforcements were lying at Sandwich waiting to cross the Channel to Somerset's aid, March and Warwick borrowed 18,000 pounds from merchants and dispatched John Dynam on a piratical expedition. He landed at Sandwich, surprised the town, took Lord Rivers and his son in their beds, robbed houses, took the principal ships of the king's navy, and carried them off, well furnished as they were with ordnance and artillery. From a time Warwick carried all before him, but not a few of his actions were most unmitigated specimens of piracy on nations little concerned with the House of York and Lancaster, their quarrels or wars. But as this is not intended to be even a sketch of the history of England, Let us pass to the commencement of the reign of Henry VII, when the great minishment and decay of the navy and the idleness of the mariners were represented to his first Parliament and led to certain enactments in regard to the use of foreign bottoms. The wines of southern France were forbidden to be imported hither in any but English, Irish, or Welsh ships, managed by English, Irish, or Welsh sailors. The act was repeated in the 4th year of Henry's reign and made to include other articles, while it was then forbidden to freight any alien ship from or to England with any manner of merchandise, if sufficient freight were to be had in English vessels, on pain of forfeiture, one half to the king, the other to the Caesars. Henry, says Lord Bacon, being a king that loved wealth and treasure, he could not endure to have trade sick, nor any obstruction to continue in the great vein which disperseth that blood. How well he loved riches is provided by the fact that when a speedy and not altogether creditable peace was established between England and France, and the indemnity had been paid by the latter, the money went into the king's private coffers. Those who had impoverished themselves in his service, or had contributed to the general outfit by the forced benevolence, were left out in the cold. From Calais, Henry wrote letters to the Lord Mayor and Aldermen, which was a courtesy, says Lord Bacon, that he sometimes used, half bragging what great sums he had obtained for the peace, as knowing well that it was ever good news in London that the king's coffers were full. Better news it would have been if their benevolence had been but a loan. Scotch historians tell us that Sir Andrew Wood of Largo, Scotland, had with his 2 vessels, the Flower and Yellow Carvel, captured 5 chosen vessels of the Royal Navy, which had infested the Firth of Forth, and had taken many prizes from the Scotch previously during this reign. Henry VII was greatly mortified by this defeat, and offered to put any means at the disposal of the officer who would undertake this service, and great rewards if Wood were brought to him alive or dead. All hesitated. Such was the renown of Wood, and his strength in men and artillery and maritime and military skill. At length Sir Stephen Bull, a man of distinguished prowess, offered himself, and 3 ships were placed under his command, with which he sailed for the Forth, and anchored behind the Isle of May, waiting Wood's return from a foreign voyage. Some fishermen were captured and detained in order that they should point out Sir Andrew's ships when they arrived. It was early in the morning when the action began. The Scots, by their skillful maneuvering, obtained the weather gauge, and the battle continued in sight of innumerable spectators who thronged the coast till darkness suspended it. It was renewed at daybreak. The ships grappled, and both parties were so intent upon the struggle that the tide carried them into the mouth of the Tay, into shoal water, that the English, seeing no means of extricating themselves, surrendered. Sir Andrew brought his prizes to Dundee. The wounded were carefully attended there, and James, with royal magnanimity, is said to have sent both prisoners and ships to Henry, praising the courage which they had displayed, and saying that the contest was for honor, not for booty. Few naval incidents occurred under the reign of Henry VII, but it belongs nevertheless to the most important age of maritime discovery. Henry had really assented to the propositions of Columbus after Portugal had refused them. Had not the latter's brother Bartholomew been captured by pirates on his way to England and detained as a slave at the oar, the Spaniards would not have had the honor of discovering the New World. This and the grand discoveries of Cabot, directly encouraged by Henry, who reached Newfoundland and Florida, the various expeditions down the African coast instituted by Don Juan, the discovery of the Cape and new route to India by Diaz and Vasco da Gama, The discovery of the Pacific by Balboa, and Cape Horn and the Straits of Magellan will be detailed in another section of this work. They belong to this and immediately succeeding reigns, and mark the grandest epoch in the history of geographical discovery. The use of firearms, says Southey, without which the conquests of the Spaniards in the New World must have been impossible, changed the character of naval war sooner than it did the system of naval tactics, though they were employed earlier by land than by sea. It is doubtful when cannon was first employed at sea. One authority says that it was by the Venetians against the Genoese before 1330. Their use necessitated very material alterations in the structures of warships. The first portholes are believed to have been contrived by a shipbuilder at Brest named Déchargé, and their introduction took place in 1499. They were circular holes cut through the sides of the vessel, and so small as scarcely to admit of the guns being traversed in the smallest degree, or fired otherwise than straight forward. Hitherto there have been no distinctions between the vessels used in commerce and in the king's service, the former being constantly employed for the latter. But now we find the addition of another tier and a general enlargement of the war vessels. Still, when any emergency required, merchant vessels, not merely English, but Genoese, Venetian, and from the Hanse towns, were constantly hired for warfare. So during peace, the king's ships were sometimes employed in trade or freighted to merchants. Henry was very desirous of increasing and maintaining commercial relations with other countries. In the commission to one of his ambassadors, he says, "The earth being the common mother of all mankind, what can be more pleasant or more humane than to communicate a portion of all her productions to all her children by commerce?" Many special commercial treaties were made by him, and one concluded with the Archduke Philip, after a dispute with him, which had put a stop to the trade with the Low Countries, was called the Great Commercial Treaty, Intercursus Magnus. It was framed with the greatest care to render the intercourse between the two countries permanent and profitable to both. The first incident in the naval history of the next reign, that of Henry VIII, grew out of an event which had occurred long before. A Portuguese squadron had in the year 1476 seized a Scottish ship laden with a rich cargo and commanded by John Barton. Letters of marque were granted him, which he had not, apparently, used to any great advantage, for they were renewed to his 3 sons 30 years afterwards. The Bartons were not content with the repaying themselves for their loss, but found the Portuguese captures so profitable that they became confirmed pirates, and when they felt their own strength, they seem with little scruple to have considered ships of any nation as their fair prize. Complaints were lodged before Henry, but were almost ignored, till the Earl of Surrey, then Treasurer and Marshal of England, declared at the council board that while he had an estate that could furnish out a ship, or a son that was capable of commanding one, the narrow seas should not be so infested. 2 ships commanded by his 2 sons, Sir Thomas and Sir Edward Howard, were made ready with the king's knowledge and consent. The 2 brothers put to sea, but were separated by stress of weather. The same happened to the 2 pirate ships, the Lion under Sir Andrew Barton's own command, and the Jenny Perwin, or Bark of Scotland. The strength of one of them is thus described in an old ballad by a merchant, one of Sir Andrew's victims, who is supposed to relate his tale to Sir Thomas Howard. "He is brass within and steel without, with beams on his topcastle strong, and 30 pieces of ordnance he carries on each side along. And he hath a pinnacle dearly dight, St. Andrew's cross it is his guide. His pinnace beareth 90 men, and 15 cannons on each side." Were he 20 ships, and he but one, I swear by kirk and bower and hall, he would overcome them every one, if once his beams they do downfall. But it was not so to be. Sir Thomas Howard, as he lay in the Downs, descried the former making for Scotland, and immediately gave chase. And there was a sore battle. The Englishmen were fierce, and the Scots defended themselves manfully, and ever Andrew blew his whistle to encourage his men. Yet, for all that, Lord Howard and his men, by clean force, entered the main deck. There the English entered on all sides, and the Scots fought sore on the hatches. But in conclusion, Andrew was taken, being so sore wounded that he died there. And then the remnant of the Scots were taken with their ship. Meantime, Sir Edward Howard had encountered the other piratical ship, and though the Scots defended themselves like hardy and well-stomached men, succeeded in boarding it. The prizes were taken to Blackwell, and the prisoners, 150 in number, being all left alive, so bloody had the action been, were tried at Whitehall before the Bishop of Winchester and a council. The bishop reminded them that though there was peace between England and Scotland, they, contrary to that, as thieves and pirates, had robbed the king's subjects within his streams, wherefore they had deserved to die by the law and to be hanged at the low water mark. Then said the Scots, "We acknowledge our offense and ask mercy, and not the law." And a priest, who was also a prisoner, said, "My lord, we appeal from the king's justice to his mercy." Then the bishop asked if he were authorized by them to say thus, and they all cried, "Yea, yea." "Well then," said the bishop, "you shall find the king's mercy above his justice, for where you were dead by the law, yet by mercy he will revive you. You shall depart out of this realm within 20 days on pain of death, if ye be found after the 20th day, and pray for the king." James subsequently required restitution from Henry, who answered with brotherly salutation that it became not a prince to charge his confederate with breach of peace for doing justice upon a pirate and thief. But there is no doubt that it was regarded as a national affair in Scotland, and helped to precipitate the war which speedily ensued. Some of the edicts of the period seem strange enough to modern ears. The Scotch Parliament had passed an act forbidding any ship freighted with staple goods to put to sea during the 3 winter months, under penalty of £5. In 1493, a generation after the act was passed, another provided that all burghs and towns should provide ships and busses, the least to be of 20 tons, fitted according to the means of said places, provided with mariners' nets and all necessary gear for taking great fish and small. The officers in every burgh were to make all the stark idle men within their bounds go on board these vessels and serve them there for their wages, or, in case of refusal, banish them from the burgh. This was done with the idea of training a maritime force, but seems to have produced little effect. James IV built a ship, however, which was, according to Scottish writers, larger and more powerfully armed than any then built in England or France. She was called the Great Michael, and was of so great stature that she wasted all the oak forests of Fife, Falkland only excepted. Southey reminds us that the Scots, like the Irish of the time, were constantly in feud with each other, and consequently destroyed their forests, to prevent the danger of ambuscades, and also to cut off the means of escape. Timber for this ship was brought from Norway, and though all the shipwrights in Scotland and many others from foreign countries were busily employed upon her, she took a year and a day to complete. The vessel is described as 12 feet in length, and 36 in breadth of beam, within the walls, which were 10 feet each thick, so that no cannonball could go through them. She had 300 mariners on board, 60 gunners, and 1,000 men of war, including officers, captains, skippers, and quartermasters. Sir Andrew Wood and Robert Barton were two of the chief officers. This great ship cumbered Scotland to get her to sea. From the time that she was afloat and her masts and sails complete, with anchors offering thereto, she was counted to the king to be £30,000 expense by her artillery, which was very costly. The great Michael never did enough to have a single exploit recorded, nor was she unfortunate enough to meet a tragic ending. In 1511, war was declared against France, and Henry caused many new ships to be made, repairing and rigging the old. After an action on the coast of Brittany, where both claimed the advantage, and where two of the largest vessels, the Cordelier with 900 Frenchmen and the Regent with 700 Englishmen, were burned, nearly all on board perishing, Henry advised a great ship to be made, such as was never before seen in England, and which was named the Henry Grace de Dieu, or popularly, the Great Harry. There are many ancient representations of this vessel, which is said to have cost £11,000, and to have taken 400 men 4 whole days to work from Erith, where she was built, to Barking Creek. Their masts, says a well-known authority, were 5 in number, but he goes on clearly to show that the 5th was simply the bowsprit. They were in one piece, as had been the usual mode in all previous times, although soon to be altered by the introduction of several joints or topmasts, which could be lowered in time of need. The rigging was simple to the last degree, but there was a considerable amount of ornamentation on the hull, and small flags were disposed almost at random on different parts of the deck and gunwale, and one at the head of each mast. The standard of England was hoisted on the principal mast. Enormous pendants or streamers were added, though ornaments which must have been often inconvenient. The Great Harry was of 1,000 tons, and in, so far as this writer can discover, the only skirmish she was concerned in the Channel, for it could not be dignified by the name of an engagement, carried 700 men. She was burned at Woolwich, at the opening of Mary's reign, through the carelessness of the sailors. End of Chapter 15, Part 3, end of Section 34. Chapter 15, Part 4 of The Sea, Its Stirring Story of Adventure, Peril, and Heroism, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Sea, Its Stirring Story of Adventure, Peril, and Heroism, Volume 1, by Frederick WHYMPER. Chapter 15, The History of Ships and Shipping Interests, Part 4. In the reign of Henry VIII, a Navy office was first formed, and regular arsenals were established at Portsmouth, Woolwich, and Deptford. The change in maritime warfare, consequent on the use of gunpowder, rendered ships of a new construction necessary, and more was done for the improvement of the Navy in this reign than in any former one. Italian shipwrights, then the most expert, were engaged, and at the conclusion of Henry's reign the Royal Navy consisted of 71 vessels, 30 of which were ships of respectable burden, aggregating 10,550 tons. 5 years later it had dwindled to less than one half. 6 years after Henry's death, England lost Calais, a fort and town which had cost Edward III, in the height of his power, an obstinate siege of 11 months. But on Elizabeth's accession to the throne, the star of England was once more in the ascendant. Elizabeth commenced her reign by providing in all points of war that she might the more quietly enjoy peace. Arms and weapons were imported from Germany at considerable cost, but in such quantities that the land had never before been so amply stored with all kinds of convenient armor and weapons. and she also was the first to cause the manufacture of gunpowder in England, that she might not both pray and pay for it too to her neighbors. She allowed the free exportation of herrings and all other sea fish in English bottoms, and a partial exemption from impressment was granted to all fishermen, while to encourage their work, Wednesday and Saturday were made fish days. This, it was stated, was meant politically, not for any superstition to be maintained in the choice of meats. The Navy became her great care, so much that foreigners named her the restorer of the glory of shipping and the queen of the North Sea. She raised the pay of sailors. The wealthier inhabitants of the sea coast, says Camden, in imitation of the princes, build ships of war, striving who should exceed, insomuch that the Queen's navy, joined with her subjects' shipping, was in short time so puissant that it was able to bring forth 20,000 fighting men for sea service. The greatest and most glorious event of her reign was, without cavil, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, at one time deemed and called the Invincible. With the political complications which preceded the invasion, we have naught to do. It was largely a religious war, inasmuch as popish machinations were at the bottom of it all. When the conquest became inevitable, the Spanish government threw off dissimulation and showed a disdainful disregard of secrecy as to its intentions, or rather a proud manifestation of them, which, says Southey, if they had been successful, might have been called magnanimous. Philip had determined on putting forth his might, and accounts which were ostentatiously published in advance termed it the most fortunate and invincible armada. The fleet consisted of 130 ships and 20 caravels, having on board nearly 20,000 soldiers, 8,450 marines, 2,088 galley slaves, with 2,630 great pieces of brass artillery. The names of all the saints appeared in the nomenclature of the ships, while, says Southey, holier appellations, which ought never to be thus applied, were strangely associated with the great griffin and the sea dog, the cat and the white falcon. Every noble house in Spain was represented, and there were 180 friars and Jesuits, with Cardinal Allen at their head, a prelate who had not long before published at Antwerp a gross libel on Elizabeth, calling her heretic, rebel, and usurper, an incestuous bastard, the bane of Christendom, and firebrand of all mischief. These priests were to bring England back to the true church the moment they landed. The galleons, being above 60 in number, were exceeding great, fair, and strong, and built high above the water, like castles, easy to be fought withal, but not so easy to board as the English and the Netherland ships. Their upper decks were musket-proof, and beneath they were 4 or 5 feet thick, so that no bullet could pass them. Their masts were bound about with oakum or pieces of fazeled ropes, and armed against all shot. The galleasses were goodly great vessels, furnished with chambers, chapels, towers, pulpits, and such like. They rowed like galleys, with exceeding great oars, each having 300 slaves, and were able to do much harm with their great ordnance. Most severe discipline was to be preserved. Blasphemy and oaths were to be punished rigidly. Gaming, as provocative of these, and quarreling were forbidden. No one might wear a dagger. Religious exercises, including the use of a special litany in which all archangels, angels, and saints were invoked to assist with their prayers against the English heretics and enemies of the faith, were enjoined. No man, says Southey, ever set forth upon a bad cause with better will, nor under a stronger delusion of perverted faith. The gunners were instructed to have half butts filled with water and vinegar, wet clothes, old sails, etc., ready to extinguish fire. And what seems strange nowadays, in addition to the regular artillery, every ship was to carry 2 boats' loads of large stones to throw on the enemy's decks, forecastles, etc., during an encounter. Meantime, Elizabeth and her ministers were fully aware of the danger, and the appeals made to the lords and through the lord lieutenants of counties were answered nobly. The first to present himself before the Queen was a Roman Catholic peer, the Viscount Montague, who brought 200 horsemen led by his own sons, and professed the resolution that, though he was very sickly and in age, to live and die in defense of the Queen and of his country against all invaders, whether it were Pope, King, or potentate whatsoever. The city of London, when 5,000 men and 15 ships were required, prayed the Queen to accept twice the number. In a very short time all her whole realm and every corner were furnished with armed men, on horseback and on foot, and those continually trained, exercised, and put into bands in warlike manner as in no age ever was before in the realm. There was no sparing of money to provide horse, armor, weapons, powder, and all necessaries. Thousands volunteered their service personally without wages. Others money for armor and weapons, and wages for soldiers. The country was never in better condition for defense. Some urged the Queen to place no reliance on maritime defense, but to receive the enemy only on shore. Elizabeth thought otherwise, and determined that the enemy should reap no more advantage on the sea than on land. She gave the command of the whole fleet to Charles Lord Howard of Effingham, Drake being vice admiral, and Hawkins and Frobisher, all grand names in naval history, being in the Western Division. Lord Henry Seymour was to lie off the coast of Flanders with 40 ships, Dutch and English, and prevent the Prince of Parma from forming a junction with the Armada. The whole number of ships collected for the defense of the country was 191, and the number of seamen 17,472. There was one ship in the fleet, the Triumph, of 1,100 tons, one of 1,000, one of 900, and two of 800 tons each, but the larger part of the vessels were very small, and the aggregate tonnage amounted to only about half that of the Armada. For the land defense, over 100,000 men were called out, regimented, and armed, but only half of them were trained. This was exclusive of the Border and Yorkshire forces. The Armada left the Tagus in the latter end of May, 1588, for Corunna, there to embark the remainder of the forces and stores. On the 30th of the same month, the Lord Admiral and Sir Francis Drake sailed from Plymouth. A serious storm was encountered, which dismasted some and dispersed others of the enemy's fleet, and occasioned the loss of 4 Portuguese galleys. One David Gwynn, a Welshman, who had been a galley slave for 11 years, took the opportunity this storm afforded, and regained his liberty. He made himself master of one galley, captured a second, and was joined by a third, in which the wretched slaves were encouraged to rise by his example, and successfully carried the 3 into a French port. After this disastrous commencement, the Armada put back to Corunna, and was pursued thither by Effingham. But as he approached the coast of Spain, the wind changed, and as he was afraid the enemy might effect the passage to the channel unperceived, he returned to its entrance, whence the ships were withdrawn, some to the coast of Ireland, and the larger part to Plymouth, where the men were allowed to come ashore, and the officers made merry with revels, dancing, and bowling. The enemy was so long in making an appearance that even Elizabeth was persuaded the invasion would not occur that year, and with this idea, Secretary Walsingham wrote to the admiral to send back 4 of his largest ships. Happily for England, and most honorably for himself, the Lord Effingham, though he had relaxed his vigilance, saw how perilous it was to act as if all were safe. He humbly entreated that nothing might be lightly credited in so weighty a matter, and that he might retain the ships, though it should be at his own cost. This was no empty show of disinterested zeal, for if the services of those ships had not been called for, there can be little doubt that in the rigid parsimony of Elizabeth's government he would have been called upon to pay the costs. The Armada, now completely refit, sailed from Corunna on July 12th, and when off the Lizard were sighted by a pirate, one Thomas Fleming, who hastened to Plymouth with the news, and not merely obtained pardon for his offenses, but was awarded a pension for life. At that time the wind blew stiffly into the harbor, but all hands were got on board, and the ships were warped out, the Lord Admiral encouraging the men and hauling at the ropes himself. By the following day 30 of the smaller vessels were out, and the next day the Armada was descried with lofty turrets like castles, and front like a half-moon, the wings thereof spreading out about the length of 7 miles, sailing very slowly through with full sails, the wind, says Camden, being as it were weary with wafting them, and the ocean groaning under their weight. The Spaniards gave up the idea of attacking Plymouth, and the English let them pass, that they might chase them in the rear. Next day the Lord Admiral sent the Defiant's pinnace forward, and opened the attack by discharging her ordnance, and later his own ship, the Ark Royal, thundered thick and furiously into the Spanish Vice Admiral's ship, and soon after Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher gave the Admiral Recalde a very thorough peppering. That officer's ship was rendered nearly unserviceable, and he was obliged to crowd on sail to catch up with the others, who showed little disposition for fighting. After a smart action in which he had injured the enemy much and suffered little hurt himself, Effingham gave over, because 40 of his ships had not yet come up from Plymouth. During the night the Spaniards lost one of their ships, which was set on fire, it was believed, by a Flemish gunner, whose wife and self had been ill-treated by the officer of the troops on board. The fire was quenched, and all her upper works had been consumed, but when the Spaniards left the hulk they abandoned 50 of their countrymen, miserably hurt. This night was remarkable for a series of disasters and contretemps. A galleon under the command of one Valdez ran foul of another ship, broke her foremast, and was left behind. Effingham, supposing that the men had been taken out, without tarrying to take possession of the prize, passed on with 2 other vessels, that he might not lose sight of the enemy. He thought that he was following Drake's ship, which ought to have carried the lanthorn that night. It proved to be a Spanish light, and in the morning he found himself in the midst of the enemy's fleet, but he managed to get away unobserved, or at all events unpursued. Drake, meantime, was mistakenly following in the dark and stormy night a phantom enemy, in the shape of 5 Easterling vessels. Meantime the English fleet, not seeing the expected light on Drake's ship, lay to during the night. Drake, next morning, had the good fortune to fall in with Valdez, who, after a brief parley, surrendered, and the prize was sent into Plymouth. Drake and his men divided 55,000 golden ducats among them, as part of the spoil on board. The hulk of the galleon was taken to Weymouth, and although burned almost to the water's edge, the gunpowder in the hold remained intact and had not taken fire. The next day there was considerable maneuvering and skirmishing, but with no very memorable loss on either side. A great Venetian ship and some smaller ones were taken from the enemy, while on our side Captain Cook died with honor in the midst of the Spanish ships, in a little vessel of his own. Both sides were wary. Effingham did not think good to grapple with them, because they had an army in the fleet, while he had none. Our army awaited their landing. The Spaniards meant as much as possible to avoid fighting and hold on till they could effect a junction with the Prince of Parma. Next morning there was little wind, and only the 4 great galleasses were engaged, these having the advantage on account of their oars while the English were becalmed. The latter, however, did considerable execution with chain shot, cutting asunder their tacklings and cordage. But they were now constrained to send ashore for gunpowder, with which they were either badly supplied or had expended too freely. Off the Isle of Wight the English battered the Spanish admiral with their great ordnance, and shot away his mainmast. But other ships came to his assistance, beat them off, and set upon the English admiral, who only escaped by a favor of a breeze, which sprung up at the right moment. Camden relates how the English shot away the lantern from one of the Spanish ships, and the breakhead from a second, and that Frobisher escaped by the skin of his teeth from a situation of great danger. Still, this was little more than skirmishing. The Spaniards say that from that time they gave over what they call the pursuit of the enemy, and they dispatched a fresh messenger to the Prince of Parma, urging him to effect his junction with them as soon as possible, and withal to send them some great shot, for they had expended theirs with more prodigality than effect. On the other hand, the English determined to wait till they could attack the enemy in the Straits of Dover, where they expected to be joined by the squadrons under Lord Seymour and Sir William Winter. Meantime, Effingham's forces were being considerably increased by volunteers, for the gentlemen of England hired ships from all parts at their own charge, and with one accord came flocking thither as to a set field. Among the volunteers were Sir Walter Raleigh, the Earls of Oxford, Northumberland, and Cumberland. On the evening of the 27th, the Spaniards came to anchor off Calais, and the English ships, now 140 in number, all of them ships fit for fight, good sailors, nimble and tight for tacking about which way they would, anchored within cannon shot. A squadron of about 30 ships belonging to the States, acting in conjunction with the Admiral of Zealand and his squadron, effectually blockaded Dunkirk, and the poor Prince of Parma, with his pressed men constantly deserting, his flat-bottomed boats leaky, and his provisions not ready, could do nothing. The Spanish ships were almost invulnerable to the shot and ordnance of the day, and their height was such that our bravest seamen were against any attempt at boarding them. These facts were well understood by Elizabeth's ministers, and the Lord Admiral was instructed to convert 8 of his worst vessels into fireships. The orders arrived so apropos of the occasion, and were so swiftly executed, that within 30 hours after the enemy had cast anchor off Calais, the ships were unloaded and dismantled, filled with combustibles, and all their ordnance charged, and their sides being smeared with pitch and rosin and wildfire, were sent in the dead of night, with wind and tide, against the Spanish fleet. When the Spaniards saw the whole sea glittering and shining with the reflection of the flames, the guns exploding as the fire reached them, and a heavy canopy of dense smoke overhead obscuring the heavens, they remembered those terrible fireships which had been used so effectively in the Scheldt, and the cry resounded through the fleet, "The fire of Antwerp." Some of the Spanish captains let their hawse oars slip, some cut their cables, and in terror and confusion put to sea, happiest they who could first be gone, though few or none could tell which course to take. In the midst of all this fearful excitement, One of the largest of the galleasses, commanded by Diogo de Moncada, ran afoul of another ship, lost her rudder, floated about at the mercy of the tide, and at length ran upon Calais sands. Here she was assailed by the English small craft, who battered her with her guns, but dared not attempt boarding till the admiral sent 100 men in his boats, under Sir Amias Preston. The Spaniards fought bravely, but at length Moncada was shot through the head, and the galleass was carried by boarding. Most of the Spanish soldiers, 400 in number, jumped overboard and were drowned. The 300 galley slaves were freed from their fetters. The vessel had 50,000 ducats on board, a booty, says Speed, well fitting the English soldiers' affections. The English were about to set the galleass on fire, but the governor of Calais prevented this by firing upon the captors, and the ship became his prize. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, admiral of the Spanish Armada, had ordered the whole fleet to weigh anchor and stand out to sea when he perceived the approaching fireships. His vessels were to return to their former stations when the danger should be over. When he fired a signal for the others to follow his example, few of them heard it, because they were scattered all about and driven by fear, some of them in the wide sea and driven among the shoals of Flanders. When they had once more congregated, they ranged themselves in order off Gravelines, where the final action was fought. Drake and Fenner were the first to assail them, followed by many brave captains. And lastly, the admiral came up with Lord Thomas Howard and Lord Sheffield. There were scarcely 2 or 23 among their ships, which matched 90 of the Spanish vessel in size, but the smaller vessels were more easily handled and maneuvered. Wherefore, says Hakluyt, using their prerogative of nimble steerage, whereby they could turn and wheel themselves with the wind which way they listed, they came oftentimes very near upon the Spaniards, and charged them so sore that now and then they were but a pike's length asunder, and so continually giving them one broadside after another. They discharged all their shot, both great and small, upon them, spending a whole day, from morning till night, in that violent kind of conflict. During this action many of the Spanish vessels were pierced through and through, between wind and water. One was sunk, and it was learned that one of her officers, having proposed to strike, was put to death by another. The brother of the slain man instantly avenged his death, and the ship went down. Others are believed to have sunk, and many were terribly shattered. One, which leaked so fast that 50 men were employed at the pumps, tried to run aground on the Flemish coast, where her captain had to strike to a Dutch commander. Our ships at last desisted from the contest, from sheer want of ammunition, and the Armada made an effort to reach the straits. Here a great engagement was expected, but the fighting was over, and that which the hand of man barely commenced, the hand of God completed. The Spaniards were now experimentally convinced that the English excelled them in naval strength. Several of their largest ships have been lost. Others were greatly damaged. There was no port to which they could repair, and to force their way through the victorious English fleet, then in sight and amounting to 140 sail, was plainly and confessedly impossible. They resolved upon returning to Spain by a northern route, and having gotten more sea room for their huge-bodied bulks, spread their mainsails and made away as fast as wind and water would give them leave. Effingham, leaving Seymour to blockade the Prince of Parma's force, followed what our chroniclers now termed the Vincible Armada, and pursued them to Scotland, where they did not attempt to land, but made for Norway, where the English, says Drake, thought it best to leave them to those boisterous and uncouth northern seas. Meantime, it was still expected ashore that the Prince of Parma might effect a landing, and it was at this time that Elizabeth, who declared her intention to be present wherever the battle might be fought, rode through the soldiers' ranks at Tilbury and made her now historical speech. "Incredible it is," says Camden, "how much she encouraged the hearts of her captains and soldiers by her presence and her words." When a false report was brought that the prince had landed, the news was immediately published throughout the camp, and assuredly, says Southey, if the enemy had set foot upon our shores, they would have sped no better than they had done at sea. Such was the spirit of the nation. Some time elapsed before the fate of the Armada was known. It was affirmed on the continent that the greater part of the English fleet had been taken and a large proportion sunk, the poor remainders having been driven into the Thames, all rent and torn. It was believed at Rome that Elizabeth was taken and England conquered. Meantime the wretched Armada was being blown hither and thither by contending winds. The mules and horses had to be thrown overboard, lest the water should fail. When they had reached a northern latitude, some 200 miles from the Scottish Isles, the Duke ordered them each to take the best course they could for Spain, and he himself, with some 25 of his best provided ships, reached it in safety. The others made for Cape Clear, hoping to water there. But a terrible storm arose, in which it is believed more than 30 of the vessels perished off the coast of Ireland. About 200 of the poor Spaniards were driven from their hiding places and beheaded through the inhumanity of Sir William Fitzwilliam. Terrified at this, the other Spaniards, sick and starved as they were, committed themselves to the sea in their shattered vessels, and very many of them were swallowed up by the waves. 2 of their ships were wrecked on the coasts of Norway. Some few got into the English seas. 2 were taken by cruisers off Rochelle. About 700 men were cast ashore in Scotland, were humanely treated, and subsequently sent by request of the Prince of Parma to the Netherlands. Of the whole Armada, only 53 vessels returned to Spain. 81 were lost. The enormous number of 14,000 men, of whom only 2,000 were prisoners, were missing. By far the largest proportion were lost by shipwreck. Philip's behavior, says Southey, when the whole of this great calamity was known, should always be recorded to his honor. He received it as a dispensation of Providence, and gave and commanded to be given throughout Spain thanks to God and the saints that it was no greater. In England a solemn thanksgiving was celebrated at St. Paul's, where the Spanish ensigns which had been taken were displayed, and the same flags were shown on London Bridge the following day, it being Southwark Fair. Many of the arms and instruments of torture taken are still to be seen in the Tower. Another great Thanksgiving Day was celebrated on the anniversary of the Queen's accession, and one of great solemnity 2 days later throughout the realm. On the Sunday following, the Queen went, as in public but Christian triumph, to St. Paul's in a chariot, made in the form of a throne with 4 pillars and drawn by 4 white horses, alighting from which at the west door she knelt and audibly praised God, acknowledging him her only defender, who had thus delivered the land from the rage of the enemy. Her privy council, the nobility, the French ambassador, the judges, and the heralds accompanied her. The streets were hung with blue cloth and flags, the several companies in their liveries being drawn up both sides of the way, with the banners in becoming and gallant order. Thus ended the most serious attempt at the invasion of England. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16, Part 1 of The Sea. Its Stirring Story of Adventure, Peril and Heroism. Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Sea. Its Stirring Story of Adventure, Peril and Heroism, Volume 1, by Frederick WHYMPER, Chapter 16, The History of Ships and Shipping Interests Continued, Part 1. Noble Adventures. The Earl of Cumberland as a Pirate. Rich Prizes. Action with the Madre di Dio. Capture of the Great Carrack. A cargo worth 150,000 pounds. Burning of the Cinco Llagas. But 15 saved out of 1,100 souls. The scourge of malice. Establishment of the slave trade. Sir John Hawkins' ventures. High-handed proceedings. The Spaniards forced to purchase. A fleet of slavers. Hawkins sanctioned by Good Queen Bess. Joins in a Negro War. A disastrous voyage. Sir Francis Drake. His first loss. The treasure at Nombre de Dio. Drake's first sight of the Pacific. Tons of silver captured. John Oxenham's voyage. The first Englishman on the Pacific. His disasters and death. Drake's voyage round the world. Bloodletting at the equator. Arrival at Port Julian. Trouble with the natives. Execution of a mutineer. Passage of the Straits of Magellan. Vessels separated in a gale. Loss of the Marigold. Tragic fate of 8 men. Drake driven to Cape Horn. Proceedings at Valparaiso. Prizes taken. Capture of the great treasure ship. Drake's resolve to change his course home. Vessel refitted at Nicaragua. Stay in the Bay of San Francisco. The natives worship the English. Grand reception at Ternate. Drake's ship nearly wrecked. Return to England. Honors accorded Drake. His character and influence. Sir Humphrey Gilbert's disasters and death. Raleigh's Virginia settlements. The spirit of adventure fostered by the grand discoveries which were constantly being made, the rich returns derived from trading expeditions, and from the pillage of our enemies, was at its zenith in the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Nor was it confined to mere soldiers of fortune, for we find distinguished noblemen of ample fortunes taking to the seas as though their daily bread depended thereupon. Among these naval adventures, there was no one, says Southey, who took to the seas so much in the spirit of a northern sea king as the Earl of Cumberland. He had borne his part in the defeat of the Armada while still a young man, and the Queen was so well satisfied with him that she gave him a commission to go the same year to the Spanish coast as general, lending him the Golden Lion, one of the ships royal, he victualling and furnishing at his own expense. After some fighting he took a prize, but soon after had to cut away his mainmast in a storm and return to England. His spirit remaining, nevertheless, higher than the winds, and more resolutely by storms compact and united in itself, we find him shortly afterwards again on the high seas with the Victory, one of the Queen's ships, and 3 smaller vessels. The Earl was not very scrupulous as regards prize-taking, and captured 2 French ships, which belonged to the party of the League. A little later he fell in with 11 ships from Hamburg and the Baltic, and fired on them till the captains came on board and showed their passports. These were respected, but not so the property of a Lisbon Jew, which they confessed to have on their ships, and which was valued at 4,500 pounds. Off the Azores he hoisted Spanish colors and succeeded in robbing some Spanish vessels. The homeward bound Portuguese fleet from the East Indies narrowly escaped him. When near Terceira, some English prisoners stole out in a small boat, having no other yard for their mainsail than 2 pipe-staves, and informed him that the Portuguese ships had left the island a week before. This induced him to return to Fayal, and the terror inspired by the English name in those days is indicated by the fact that the town of about 500 houses was found to be completely empty. The inhabitants had abandoned it. He set a guard over the churches and monasteries, and then calmly waited till a ransom of 2,000 ducats was brought him. He helped himself to 58 pieces of iron ordnance, and the governor of Graciosa, to keep on good terms with the earl, sent him 60 butts of wine. While there, a Weymouth privateer came in with a Spanish prize worth 16,000 pounds. Next we find the earl at St. Mary's, where he captured a Brazilian sugar ship. In bringing out their prize, they were detained on the harbor bar, exposed to the enemy. 80 of Cumberland's men were killed, and he himself was wounded. His head also was broken with stones, so that the blood covered his face, and both his face and legs were burnt with fireballs. The prize, however, was secured and forwarded to England. Cumberland himself held on his course to Spain, and soon fell in with a ship of 400 tons from Mexico, laden with hides, cochineal, sugar, and silver, and the captain had with him a venture to the amount of 25,000 ducats, which was taken. They now resolved to return home, but sea fortunes are variable, having 2 inconsistent parents, air and water, and as one of the adventurers concisely put it, these summer services and ships of sugar proved not so sweet and pleasant as the winter was afterwards sharp and painful. Lister, the earl's captain, was sent in the Mexican prize for England, and was wrecked off Cornwall, everything being lost in her, and all the crew, save 5 or 6 men. On the earl's ship, contrary winds and gales delayed them so greatly that their water failed. They were reduced to 3 spoonfuls of vinegar apiece at each meal. This state of affairs lasting 14 days, except what water they could collect from rain and hail storms. Yet was that rain so intermingled with the spray of the foaming sea in that extreme storm that it could not be healthful. Yea, some in their extremity of thirst drank themselves to death with their cans of salt water in their hands. Some 10 or 12 perished on each of as many consecutive nights, and the storm was at one time so violent that the ship was almost torn to pieces. His lordship's cabin, the dining room, and the half-deck became all one, and he was obliged to seek a lodging in the hold. The earl, however, constantly encouraged the men, and the small stock of provisions was distributed with the greatest equality. So at last they reached a haven on the west coast of Ireland, where their sufferings ended. On this voyage they had taken 13 prizes. The Mexican prize, which had been wrecked, would have added 100,000 pounds to the profits of the venture, but even with this great deduction the earl had been doubly repaid for his outlay. The earl's 3rd expedition was a failure, but the 4th resulted in the capture of the Madre de Dios, one of the largest carracks belonging to the Portuguese crown. In this, however, some of Raleigh's and Hawkins's ships had a share. Captain Thompson, who came up with her first, again and again delivered his peals as fast as he could fire, and fall astern to load again, thus hindering her way, though somewhat to his own cost, till the others could come up. Several others worried the carrack, until the earl's ship came up about 11 at night. Captain Norton had no intention of boarding the enemy till daylight, if there had not been a cry from one of the ships royal then in danger, "And you be men, save the Queen's ship." Upon this carrack was boarded on both sides. A desperate struggle ensued, and it took an hour and a half before the attacking party succeeded in getting possession of the high forecastle, so brave a booty making the men fight like dragons. The ship won. The boarders turned to pillage, and while searching about with candles, managed to set fire to a cabin containing some hundreds of cartridges, very nearly blowing up the ship. The hotness of the action was evidenced by the number of dead and dying who strewed the carrack's decks, especially, says the chronicler, about the helm, for the greatness of the steerage requiring the labor of 12 or 14 men at once, and some of our ships beating her at the stern with their ordnance, oftentimes with one shot, slew 4 or 5 laboring on either side of the helm, whose room being still furnished with fresh supplies, and our artillery still playing upon them with continual volleys, it could not be but that much blood should be shed in that place. For the times, the prisoners were treated with great humanity, and surgeons were sent on board to dress their wounds. The captain, Don Fernando de Mendoza, was a gentleman of noble birth, well stricken in years, well spoken, of comely personage, of good stature, but of hard fortune. Twice he had been taken prisoner by the Moors, and ransomed by the king, and he had been wrecked on the coast of Sofala, in a carrack which he commanded, and having escaped the sea danger, fell into the hands of infidels ashore, who kept him under long and grievous servitude. The prisoners were allowed to carry off their own valuables, put on board one of Cumberland's ships, and sent to their own country. Unfortunately for them, they again fell in with other English cruisers who robbed them without mercy, taking from them 900 diamonds and other valuable things. About 800 Negroes on board were landed on the island of Corvo. Her cargo consisted of jewels, spices, drugs, silks, calicoes, carpets, canopies, ivory, porcelain, and innumerable curiosities. It was estimated to amount to 150,000 pounds in value, and there was considerable haggling over its division, and no little embezzlement. The Queen had a large share of it, and Cumberland netted 36,000 pounds. The carrack created great astonishment at Dartmouth by her dimensions, which for those days were enormous. She was of about 1,600 tons burden and 165 feet long. She was of 7 several stories, 1 main orlop, 3 close decks, 1 forecastle of great height, and a spar deck of 2 floors apiece. Her mainmast was 125 feet in height, and her mainyard 105 feet long. Being so huge and unwieldy a ship, says Purchas, she was never removed from Dartmouth, but there laid up her bones. In 1594, the Earl set forth on his 8th voyage with 3 ships, a caravel and a pinnace, furnished at his own expense, with the help of some adventurers. Early in the voyage they descried a great Indian ship, whose burden they estimated at 2,000 tons. Her name was the Cinco Chaga, the 5 wounds, and her fate was as tragical as her name. She had on board a number of persons who had been shipwrecked in 3 vessels, which, like herself, had been returning from the Indies. When she left Mozambique for Europe, she had on board 1,400 persons, an enormous number for those days. On the voyage she had encountered terrible gales, and after putting in at Luanda for water and supplies, and shipping many slaves, a fatal pestilence known by the name of the Mal de Luanda carried off about half the crew. The captain wished to avoid the Azores, but a mutiny had arisen among the soldiers on board, and he was forced to stand by them, and by this means came in contact with the Earl of Cumberland's squadron off Fayal. The Portuguese had pledged themselves to the ship at all hazards, and to perish with her in the sea or in the flames, rather than yield so rich a prize to the heretics. Cumberland's ships, after harassing the Carrack on all sides, ranged up against her. Twice she was boarded, and twice were the assailants driven out. A third time the privateers boarded her, one of them bearing a white flag. He was the first of the party killed, and when a second hoisted another flag at the poop, it was immediately thrown overboard. The English suffered considerably, more especially among the officers. Cumberland's vice-admiral, Antony, was killed. Downtown, the rear admiral crippled for life, and Cave, who commanded the Earl's ship, mortally wounded. The privateers seem, in the heat of action, almost to have forgotten the valuable cargo on board, and to have aimed only at destroying her after many bickerings, says the chronicler. Fireworks flew about interchangeably. At last the vice-admiral, with a culverin shot at hand, fired the Carrack in her stern, and the rear-admiral her forecastle. Then, flying and maintaining their fires so well with their small shot that many which came to quench them were slain, the fire made rapid headway, and P. Fray Antonio, a Franciscan, was seen with a crucifix in his hand, encouraging the poor sailors to commit themselves to the waves and to God's mercy rather than perish in the flames. A large number threw themselves overboard, clinging to such things as were cast into the sea. It is said that the English boats, with one honorable exception, made no efforts to save any of them. It is even stated that they butchered many in the water. According to the English account, there were more than 1,100 on board the Carrack when she left Owanda, and whom only 15 were saved. 2 ladies of high rank, mother and daughter, the latter of whom was going home to Spain to take possession of some entailed property, when they saw there was no help to be expected from the privateers, fastened themselves together with a cord and committed themselves to the waves. Their bodies were afterwards cast ashore on Fayal, still united, though in the bonds of death. The Earl afterwards built the Scourge of Malice, a ship of 800 tons, and the largest yet constructed by an English subject, and in 1597 obtained letters patent authorizing him to levy sea and land forces. Without royal assistance, he gathered 18 sail. This expedition, although it worried and impoverished the Spaniards, was not particularly profitable to the Earl. He took Puerto Rico, and then abandoned it, and did not, as he expected, intercept either outward-bound East Indiamen, who indeed were too frightened to venture out to the Tagus that year, or the homeward-bound Mexican fleet. This was Cumberland's last expedition, and no other subject ever undertook so many at his own cost. The Elizabethan age was otherwise so glorious that it is painful to have to record the establishment of the slave trade, a serious blot on the reign, one which no Englishman of today would defend, but which was then looked upon as perfectly legitimate. John Hawkins, afterwards Sir John, was born at Plymouth, and his father had long been a well-esteemed sea captain, the first Englishman, it is believed, who ever traded to the Brazils. The young man had gained so much renown by trips to Spain, Portugal, and the Canaries, and having grown in love and favor with the Canarians by good and upright dealing, began to think of more extended enterprises. Learning that Negroes were very good merchandise in Hispaniola, and that store of them might easily be had upon the coast of Guinea, he communicated with several London ship owners, who liked his schemes, and provided him, in large part, with the necessary outfit. 3 small vessels were provided, the Solomon of 120 tons, the Swallow of 100, and the Jonas of 40. Hawkins left England in October 1562, and proceeding to Sierra Leone, got into his possession, partly by the sword and partly by other means, to the number of 300 Negroes, at the least, besides other merchandise which that country yieldeth. At the port of Isabella, Porto de Plata, and Monte Cristo, he made sale of the slaves to the Spaniards, trusting them no farther than by his own strength he was able to master them. He received in exchange pearls, ginger, sugar, and hides enough not merely to freight his own vessels, but 2 other hulks, and thus with prosperous success and much gain to himself and the aforesaid adventurers, he came home and arrived in September 1563. The second expedition was on a larger scale and included a queen's ship of 700 tons. Hawkins, arriving off the Rio Grande, could not enter it for want of a pilot, but he proceeded to Sambula, one of the islands near its mouth, where he went every day on shore to take the inhabitants with burning and spoiling their towns, and got a number of slaves. Flushed with easy success, Hawkins was persuaded by some Portuguese to attack a Negro town called Baimiba, where he was informed there was much gold. 40 of his men were landed, and they, dispersing, to secure what booty they could for themselves, became an easy prey to the Negroes, who killed 7, including one of the captains, and wounded 27. After a visit to Sierra Leone, which he left quickly on account of the illness and death of some of his men, he proceeded to the West Indies, where he carried matters with a high hand at the small Spanish settlements, at which, very generally, the poor inhabitants had been forbidden to trade with him by the viceroy, then stationed at St. Domingo. To this he replied at Borborata that he was in need of refreshment and money also, without which he could not depart. Their princes were in amity one with another. The English had free traffic in Spain and Flanders, and he knew no reason why they should not have the like in the King of Spain's dominions. Upon this the Spaniards said they would send to their governor, who was 80 leagues off. 10 days must elapse before his determination could arrive. Meantime, he might bring his ships into the harbor, and they would supply him with any victuals he might require. The ships sailed in and were supplied, but Hawkins, advising himself that to remain there 10 days idle, spending victuals and men's wages, and perhaps in the end receive no good answer from the governor, it were mere folly, requested license to sell certain lean and sick negroes for whom he had little or no food, but would recover with proper treatment ashore. This request, he said, he was forced to make, as he had not otherwise wherewith to pay for necessary supply to him. He received a license to sell 30 slaves, but now few showed a disposition to buy, and where they did, came to haggle and cheapen. Hawkins made a feint to go when the Spaniards bought some of his poorer negroes, but when the purchasers paid the duty and required the customary receipt, the officer refused to give it, and instead of carrying the money to the king's account, distributed it to the poor for the love of God. The purchasers feared that they might have to pay the duty a second time, and the trade was suspended till the governor arrived on the 14th day. To him Hawkins told a long-winded story, concluding by saying that it would be taken well at the governor's hand if he granted a license in this case, seeing that there was a great amity between their princes, and that the thing pertained to our Queen's Highness. The petition was taken under consideration in council, and at last granted. The license of 30 ducats demanded for each slave sold did not, however, meet Hawkins' views, and he therefore landed 100 men, well armed, and marched toward the town. The poor townspeople sent out messengers to know his demands, and he requested that the duty should be 7.5%, and mildly threatened that if they would not accede to this he would displease them. Everything was conceded, and Hawkins obtained the prices he wanted. Fancy a modern merchant standing with an armed guard, pistol in hand, over his customers, insisting that he would sell what he liked and at his own price. But all this is nothing to what happened at Rio de la Hacha. There he spoke of his quiet traffic at Borburata, and requested permission to trade there in the same manner. He was told that the viceroy had forbidden it, whereupon he threatened them that he must either have the license or they stand to their own defense. The license was granted, but they offered half the prices which he had obtained at Barbaruta, whereupon he told them, insultingly, that seeing they had sent him this to his supper, he would in the morning bring them as good a breakfast. Accordingly, early next day, he fired off a culverin and prepared to land with 100 men, having light ordnance in his great boat, and in the other boats double bases in their noses. The townsmen marched out in battle array, but when the guns were fired, fell flat on their faces, and soon dispersed. Still about 30 horsemen made a show of resistance, their white leather targets in one hand and their javelins in the other. But as soon as Hawkins marched towards them, they sent a flag of truce, and the treasurer, in a cautious interview with this ugly merchant, granted all he asked, and the trade proceeded. They parted with a show of friendship, and saluted each other with their guns, the townspeople glad to be sped of such traders. On the return voyage, contrary winds prevailed, till victuals scanted, so that they were in despair of ever reaching home, had not God provided for them better than their deserving. They arrived at Padstow in Cornwall with the loss, says the narrative printed in Hakluyt's collection, of 20 persons in all the voyage, and with great profit to the venturers, as also to the whole realm in bringing home both gold, silver, pearls, and other jewels in great store. His name, therefore, be praised for evermore. Amen. They did not consider that they had been engaged in a most iniquitous traffic, nor was it indeed the opinion of the times. Hawkins, says Southey, then is not individually to be condemned, if he looked upon dealing in negroes to be as lawful as any other trade, and thought the force or sacrifice might be employed for taking them with as little compunction as in hunting, fishing, or fowling. He had a coat of arms and crest bestowed upon him and his posterity. Among other devices, it bore a demi-Moor in his proper color, bound and captive, with amulets on his arms, etc. On his next expedition for slaving purposes, he had 6 vessels. Herrera says that 2 Portuguese had offered to conduct this fleet to a place where they might load their vessels with gold and other riches, and that the Queen had been so taken with the idea that she had supplied Hawkins with 2 ships, he and his brother fitting out 4 others and a pinnace. The force on board amounted to 1,500 soldiers and sailors, who were to receive a third of the profits. When the expedition was ready, the Portuguese deserted from Plymouth and went to France. But as the cost of the outfit had been incurred, it was thought proper to proceed. Hawkins obtained, after a great deal of trouble, less than 150 slaves between the Rio Grande and Sierra Leone. At this juncture, a Negro king, just going to war with a neighboring tribe, sent to the commander asking his aid, promising him all the prisoners who should be taken. This was tempting bait, and 120 men were sent to assist the colored warrior. They assaulted a town containing 8,000 inhabitants, strongly paled and well defended, and the English, losing 6 men and having a fourth of their number wounded, sent for more help. Whereupon, says Hawkins, considering that the good success of this enterprise might highly further the commodity of our voyage, I went myself, and with the help of the king of our side, assaulted the town both by land and sea, and very hardily, with fire, their houses being covered with dry palm leaves, obtained the town, and put the inhabitants to flight, where we took 250 persons, men, women, and children. And by our friend, the king of our side, there were taken 600 prisoners, whereof we hope to have had our choice. But the Negro, in which nation is seldom or never found truth, meant nothing less, for that night he removed his camp and prisoners, so that we were fain to content us with those few that we had gotten ourselves. They had obtained between 400 and 500, a part of which were speedily sold as he reached the West Indies. At Rio de la Hacha, from whence came all the pearls, the treasurer would by no means allow them to trade, or even to water the ships, and had fortified the town with additional bulwarks, well manned by harquebusiers. Hawkins again enforced trade by landing 200 men, who stormed their fortifications, at which the Spaniards fled. Thus having the town, says Hawkins, with some circumstance, as partly by the Spaniards' desire of negroes and partly by friendship of the treasurer, we obtained a secret trade, whereupon the Spaniards resorted to us by night, and bought of us to the number of 200 negroes. This voyage ended most disastrously. Passing by the west end of Cuba, they encountered a terrific storm, which lasted 4 days, and they had to cut down all the higher buildings of the Jesus, their largest ship. Her rudder, too, was nearly disabled, and she leaked badly. They made for the coast of Florida, but could find no suitable haven. Thus, being in great despair, and taken with a new storm, which continued other 3 days, Hawkins made for St. Juan de Ulua, a port of the city of Mexico. They took on their way 3 ships, having on board 100 passengers, and soon reached the harbor. The Spaniards mistook them for a fleet from Spain, which was expected about that time, and the chief officers came aboard to receive their dispatches. Being deceived of their expectation, they were somewhat alarmed, but finding that Hawkins wanted nothing but provisions, were recomforted. I found in the same port, says Hawkins, 12 ships, which had in them, by report, 200,000 pounds in gold and silver, all of which being in my possession with the King's Island, as also the passengers before in my way thitherward stayed, I set at liberty, without the taking from them the weight of a groat. This savors rather of impudent presumption, for he was certainly not in good condition to fight at that period. Next day the Spanish fleet arrived outside, when Hawkins again rode the high horse, by giving notice to the general that he would not suffer them to enter the port until conditions had been made for their safe being, and for the maintenance of peace. The fleet had on board a new viceroy, who answered amicably, and desired him to propose his conditions. Hawkins required not merely victuals and trade, and hostages to be given on both sides, but that the island should be in his possession during his stay, with such ordnance as was planted there, and that no Spaniard might land on the island with any kind of weapon. These terms the viceroy somewhat disliked at first, nor is it very surprising that he did, but at length he pretends to consent, and the Spanish ships entered the port. In a few days it became evident that treachery was intended, as men and weapons in quantities were being transferred from and to the Spanish ships, and new ordnance landed on the island. Hawkins sent to inquire what was meant, and was answered with fair words. Still unsatisfied, he sent the master of the Jesus, who spoke Spanish, to the viceroy, and required to be satisfied if any such thing were or not. The viceroy, now seeing that the treason must be discovered, retained the master, blew his trumpet, and it became evident that a general attack was intended. A number of the English crews ashore were immediately massacred. They attempted to board the Minion and Jesus, but were kept out, with great loss on both sides. Now, says Hawkins, when the Jesus and the Minion were gotten about 2 ships' lengths from the Spanish fleet, the fight began so hot on all sides that within 1 hour the admiral of the Spaniards was supposed to be sunk, their vice-admiral burnt, and 1 other of their principal ships supposed to be sunk. The Spaniards used their shore artillery to such effect that it cut all the masts and yards of the Jesus and sunk Hawkins's smaller ships, the Judith only excepted. It had been determined, as there was little hope to get the Jesus away, that she should be placed as a target or defense for the Minion till night, when they would remove such of her stores and valuables as was possible and then abandon her. As we were thus determining, says Hawkins, and he placed the Minion from the shot of the land, suddenly the Spaniards fired 2 great ships which were coming directly with us, and having no means to avoid the fire, it bred among the men a marvelous fear, so that some said, "Let us depart with the Minion." Others said, "Let us see whether the wind will carry the fire from us." But to be short, the Minion's men, which had always their sails in readiness, thought to make shore work, and so, without their consent of the captain or master, cut their sail. Hawkins was very hardly received on board, and many of the men of the Jesus were left to their fate and the mercy of the Spaniards, which, he says, I doubt was very little. Only the Minion and the Judith escaped, and the latter deserted that same night. Beaten about in unknown seas for the next 14 days, hunger at last enforced them to seek the land, for hides were thought very good meat, rats, cats, mice, and dogs. None escaped that might be gotten. Parrots and monkeys that were had in great price were thought then very profitable if they served the turn of one dinner. So starved and worn out were they, that about 100 of his people desired to be left on the coast of Tabasco, and Hawkins determined to water there, and then, with as little remain of victuals, to attempt the voyage home. During this time, while on shore with 50 of his men, a gale arose, which prevented them regaining the ship. Indeed, they expected to see it wrecked before their eyes. At last the storm abated, and they sailed for England, the men dying off daily from sheer exhaustion, the pitiful remainder being scarcely able to work the ship. They at last reached the coast of Galicia, where they obtained fresh meat, and putting into Vigo were assisted by some English ships lying there. Hawkins concludes his narrative as follows. If all the miseries and troublesome affairs of this sorrowful voyage should be perfectly and thoroughly written, there should need a painful man with his pen, and as great a time as he had that wrote the lives and deaths of the martyrs. End of chapter 16, part 1. Chapter 16, part 2 of The Sea, Its Stirring Story of Adventure, Peril and Heroism, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Sea, Its Stirring Story of Adventure, Peril, and Heroism, Volume 1, by Frederick WHYMPER. Chapter 16, The History of Ships and Shipping Interests Continued, Part 2. The Judith, which made one of Hawkins' last fleet, was commanded by Francis Drake, a name that was destined to become one of the most famous of the day, and very terrible to the Spaniards. In this last venture, he lost all that he had accumulated by earlier voyages, but a divine belonging to the fleet comforted him with the assurance that having been so treacherously used by the Spaniards, he might lawfully recover in value of the King of Spain, and repair his losses upon him whenever he could. This comfortable doctrine consoled him. The case, says Fuller, was clear in sea divinity. 2 or 3 minor voyages he made to gain knowledge of the field of operation, and in the West Indies made some little money by playing the seaman and the pirate. On May 24th, 1572, he sailed from Plymouth in the Pasha of 70 tons, his brother accompanying him in the Swan of only 25 tons. They had 3 pinnaces on board, taken to pieces and stowed away. The force with which he was to revenge himself on the Spanish monarch numbered 73 men and boys all told. In the Indies he was joined by Captain Rouse of an Isle of Wight bark, with 38 men on board. Let us see how they sped. It was known that there was a great treasure at Nombre de Dio, and thither the little squadron shaped its course. The town was unwalled, and they entered without difficulty, but the Spaniards received them in the marketplace with a volley of shot. Drake returned the greeting with a flight of arrows, the best ancient English compliment, but in the attack received a wound in his leg, which he dissembled, knowing that if the general's heart stoop, the men's will fall. He arrived at the treasury house, which was full of silver bars, and while in the act of ordering his men to break it open, fainted from the loss of blood, and his men, binding up the wound, forcibly took him to his pinnace. It was time, for the Spaniards had discovered their weakness, and could have overcome them. Rather disappointed here, Drake made for Carthagena, and took several vessels on his way. He learned from some escaped Negro slaves, settled on the Isthmus of Darien, that the treasure was brought from Panama to Nombre de Dio upon mules, a party of which he might intercept. Drake's leg having healed, he was led to an eminence on that isthmus, where from a great tree both the Pacific and Atlantic might be seen. Steps had been cut in the trunk of this huge tree, and at the top a convenient arbor had been made wherein 12 men might sit. Drake saw from its summit that great southern ocean, the Pacific Ocean, of which he had heard something already, and being inflamed with ambition of glory and hopes of wealth, was so vehemently transported with desire to navigate that sea, that falling down there upon his knees, he implored the divine assistance that he might at some time or another sail thither, and make a perfect discovery of the same. Drake was the first Englishman to gaze on its waters. On the isthmus, Drake encountered an armed party of Spaniards, but put them to flight, and destroyed merchandise to the value of 200,000 ducats. Soon afterward he heard the sweet music of the mules coming with a great noise of bells, and when the trains came up he found that they had no one but the muleteers to protect them. It was easy work to take as much silver as they would, but more difficult to transport it to the coast. They in consequence buried several tons, but one of his men, who fell into the hands of the Spaniards, was compelled by torture to reveal the place, and when Drake's people returned for a second load it was nearly all gone. When they returned to the coast where the pinnaces should have met them, they were not to be seen, but in place 7 Spanish pinnaces which had been searching the coast. Drake escaped their notice, and constructing a raft of the trees which the river brought down, mounted a biscuit sack for sail, and steered it with an oar made from a sapling, out to sea, where they were constantly up to their waists in water. At last they caught sight of their own pinnaces, ran the raft ashore, and traveled by land round to the point off which they were laying. They then embarked their comrades with the treasure, and rejoined the ship. One of their Negro allies took a great fancy to Drake's sword, and when it was presented to him, desired the commander to accept 4 wedges of gold. Drake accepted them as courteously as they were preferred, but threw them into the common stock, saying it was just that they who bore part of the charge in setting him to sea should enjoy their full proportion of the advantage at his return. Drake made the passage home to the Scilly Isles in the wonderfully short period of 23 days. Arriving at Plymouth on a Sunday, the news was carried into the church during the sermon time, and there remained few or no people with the preacher. for Drake was already a great man and a hero in the eyes of all Devon. John Oxenham, who had served with Drake in the varied capacities of soldier, sailor, and cook, was very much in the latter's confidence. Drake had particularly spoken of his desire to explore the Pacific, and Oxenham, in reply, had protested that he would follow him by God's grace. The latter, who had gotten among the seamen the name of captain for his valor, and had privily scraped together good store of money, becoming impatient, determined to attempt the enterprise his late master had projected. He reached the isthmus to find that the mule trains conveying the silver were now protected by a convoy of soldiers, and he determined on a bold and novel adventure. He drew his ship aground in a retired and woody creek, covered it up with boughs, buried his provisions and his great guns, and taking with him 2 small pieces of ordnance, went with all his men and 6 maroon guides about 12 leagues into the interior, to a river which discharges itself into the South Sea. There he cut wood and built a pinnace, which was 45 feet by the keel, embarked in it, and secured for himself the honor of having been the first Englishman to sail over the waters of the blue Pacific. In this pinnace he went to the Peril Islands, and lay in wait for vessels. He was successful in capturing a small bark, bringing gold from Quito, and scarcely a week later another with silver from Lima. He also obtained a few pearls on the islands. So far, fortune had followed Oxenham, and to his own want of caution is due the fact that this prosperous state of affairs was soon reversed. He had dismissed his prizes when near the mouth of the river, and had allowed them to perceive where he was entering. The alarm was soon given, first indeed by some negroes who hastened to Panama. Juan de Ortega was immediately dispatched with 100 men, besides negro rowers and 4 barks. After entering the river, a 4-day search rewarded him by the discovery of the pinnace with 6 Englishmen on board, who leaped ashore and ran for dear life. One only was killed at this juncture. Ortega discovered in the woods the hut in which Oxenham had concealed the treasure, and removed it to his barks. Meantime, Oxenham, whose men had been disputing over the division of spoils, had been to a distance for the purpose of inducing some of the maroon negroes to act as carriers, and returning with them, met the men who had escaped from the pinnace and those who were fleeing from the hut. The loss of their booty at once completed their reconcilement. He promised larger shares if they should succeed in recapturing it, and marched resolutely in quest of the Spaniards, relying upon the Maroons as well as upon his own people. But Ortega and his men were experienced in bushfighting, and they succeeded in killing 11 Englishmen and 5 Negroes, and took 7 of Oxenham's party prisoners. He, with the remnant of his party, went back to search for his hidden ship. It had been removed by the Spaniards, and now the latter sent 150 men to hunt the Englishmen out, while those whom they failed to take were delivered up by the natives. Oxenham and 2 of his officers were taken to Lima and executed. The remainder suffered death at Panama. The greatest semi-commercial and piratical voyage of this epoch is undoubtedly that of Drake, who reached the South Seas via the Straits of Magellan, the 3rd recorded attempt, and the first made by an Englishman, and was the first English subject to circumnavigate the globe. Elizabeth gave it her secret sanction, and when Drake was introduced to her court by Sir Christopher Hatton, presented him a sword with this remarkable speech: "We do account that he which striketh at thee, Drake, striketh at us." The expedition, fitted at his own cost, and that of various adventurers, comprised 5 vessels, the largest, his own ship, the Pelican, being only 100 tons. His whole force consisted of 164 men, gentlemen, and sailors, and was furnished with such plentiful provisions of all things necessary as so long and dangerous a voyage seemed to require. The frames of 4 pinnaces were taken, to be put together as occasion might require. Neither did he admit, it is said, to make provision for ornament and delight, carrying to this purpose with him expert musicians, rich furniture, all the vessels for his table, yea, many belonging to the cook-room being of pure silver, with divers shows of all sorts of curious workmanship, whereby the civility and magnificence of his native country might, among all nations, whither he should come, be the more admired. Few of his companions knew at the outset the destination of his voyage. It was given out that they were bound merely for Alexandria. The expedition sailed on November 15, 1577, from Plymouth, and immediately encountered a storm so severe that the vessels came near shipwreck, and were obliged to put back and refit. When they had again started under fairer auspices, Drake gave his people some little information as to his proposed voyage, and appointed an island off the coast of Barbary as a rendezvous in case of separation at sea, and subsequently Cape Blanco, where he mustered his men ashore and put them through drills and warlike exercises. Already, early in January, he had taken some minor Spanish prizes, and a little later, off the island of Santiago, chased a Portuguese ship bound for Brazil, with many passengers, and among other commodities, good store of wine. Drake captured and set the people of one of his smaller pinnaces, giving them their clothes, some provisions, and 1 butt of wine, letting them all go except their pilot. The provisions and wine on board the prize proved invaluable to the expedition. From the Cape de Verde Islands, they were 9 weeks out of sight of land, and before they reached the coast of Brazil, when near the equator, Drake, being very careful of his men's health, let every one of them blood with his own hands. On nearing the Brazilian coast, the inhabitants made great fires for a sacrifice to the devils, about which they use conjurations, making heaps of sand and other ceremonies, that when any ships shall go about to stay upon their coast, not only sands may be gathered together in shoals in every place, but also that storms and tempests may arise, to the casting away of ships and men. Near the Plata they slaughtered large numbers of seals, thinking them good and acceptable meat, both as food for the present and as a supply of provisions for the future. Further south, they found stages constructed on the rocks by the natives for drying the flesh of ostriches. Their thighs were as large as reasonable legs of mutton. At a spot which Drake named Seal Bay, they remained a fortnight. Here they made new provisions of seals, whereof they slew to the number of from 200 to 300 in the space of an hour. Some little traffic ensued with the natives, all of whom were highly painted, some of them having the whole of one side from crown to heel painted black and the other white. They fed on seals and other flesh, which they ate nearly raw, casting pieces of 4 or 6 pounds weight into the fire, till it was a little scorched, and then tearing into pieces with their teeth like lions. At the sound of Drake's band of trumpeters they showed great delight, dancing on the beach with the sailors. They were described as of large stature. One of these giants, said the chaplain of the expedition, standing with our men when they were taking their morning draughts, showed himself so familiar that he also would do as they did, and taking a glass in his hand, being strong canary wine, it came no sooner to his lips than it took him by the nose, and so suddenly entered his head that he was so drunk, or at least so overcome, that he fell right down, not able to stand. Yet he held the glass fast in his hand without spilling any of the wine, and when he came to himself he tried again, and tasting by degrees got to the bottom. From which time he took such a liking to the wine that, having learnt the name, he would every morning come down from the mountains with a mighty cry of "Wine! Wine! Wine!" continuing the same until he arrived at the tent. After some trouble caused by the separation of the vessels, the whole fleet arrived safely at the good harborough called by Magellan Port Julian, where nearly the first sight they met was a gibbet, on which the Portuguese navigator had executed several mutinous members of his company, some of the bones of whom yet remained. Drake himself was to have trouble here. At the outset the natives appeared friendly, and a trial of skill in shooting arrows resulted in an English gunner exceeding their efforts, at which they appeared pleased by the skill shown. A little while after another Indian came, but of a sour sort, and one Winter, prepared for another display of archery, unfortunately broke the bowstring when he drew it to its full length. This disabused the natives to some extent of the superior skill of the English, and an attack was made, apparently incited by the Indian just mentioned. Poor Winter received 2 wounds, and the gunner, coming to the rescue with his gun, missed fire and was immediately shot through the breast and out at back, so that he fell down stark dead. Drake assembled his men, ordering them to cover themselves with their targets and march on the assailants, instructing them to break the arrows shot at them, noting that the savages had but a small store. At the same time he took the piece which had so unhappily missed-fired, aimed at the Indian who had killed the gunner, and who was the man who had begun the fray, and shot him in the belly. An arrow wound, however severe, the savage would have borne without betraying any indication of pain, but his cries upon being thus wounded were so loud and hideous that his companions were terrified and fled, though many were then hastening to their assistance. Drake did not pursue them, but hastened to convey Winter to the ship for speedy help. No help, however, availed, and he died on the second day. The gunner's body, which had been left on shore, was sent for the next day. The savages, meantime, had stripped it, as if for the sake of curiously inspecting it, the clothes they had lain under the head, and stuck an English arrow in the right eye for mockery. Both bodies were buried in a little island in the harbor. No farther attempt was made to injure the English, who remained 2 months in the harbor, but friendly relations were not established. A more serious event was to follow. One Master Doty was suspected and accused of something worse than ordinary mutiny or insubordination. It is affirmed in a history of the voyage, published under the name of Drake's nephew, that Doty had embarked on the expedition for the distinct purpose of overthrowing it for his own aggrandizement, to accomplish which he intended to raise a mutiny and murder the admiral and his most attached followers. Further, it is stated that Drake was informed of this before he left Plymouth, but that he would not credit that a person whom he so dearly loved would conceive such evil purposes against him. Doty had been put in possession of the Portuguese prize, but had been removed on a charge of peculation, and it is likely that resentment, whether for the wrongful charge or the rightful removal, might be rankling in him. At all events, his later conduct and mutinous words left no alternative to Drake but to examine him before a properly constituted court, and he seems to have most reluctantly gone even to this length. He was found guilty by 12 men after the English manner, and suffered accordingly. The most indifferent persons in the fleet, says Southey, were of opinion that he had acted seditiously, and that Drake cut him off because of his emulous designs. The question is, how far those designs extended, He could not aspire to the credit of the voyage without devising how to obtain for himself some more conspicuous station in it than that of a gentleman volunteer. If he regarded Drake as a rival, he must have hoped to supplant or at least to vie with him, and in no other way could he have vied with him but by making off with one of the ships and trying his own fortune, which was afterwards actually accomplished by others. Doughty was condemned to death, and he, says a writer, quoted by Hakluyt, seeing no remedy but patience for himself, desired before his death to receive the communion, which he did at the hands of Master Fletcher, our minister, and our general himself accompanied him in that holy action, which being done, and the place of execution made ready, he, having embraced our general, and taken leave of all the company, with prayer for the Queen's Majesty and our realm, in quiet sort laid his head to the block, where he ended his life. One account says that after partaking of the communion, Drake and Doughty dined at the same table together, as cheerful in sobriety as ever in their lives they had done, and taking their leave by drinking to each other, as if some short journey only had been in hand. A provost marshal had made all things ready, and after drinking this funeral stirrup cup, Doughty went to the block. Drake subsequently addressed the whole company, exhorting them to unity and subordination, asking them to prepare reverently for a special celebration of the Holy Communion on the following Sunday. And now, having broken up the Portuguese prize on account of its unseaworthiness, and rechristened his own ship, the Pelican, into the Golden Hind, Drake entered the straits now named after Magellan, though that navigator termed them the Patagonian Straits because he found the natives wearing clumsy shoes, or sandals, patagon signifying in Portuguese a large, ill-shaped foot. The land surrounding the straits is high and mountainous, and the water generally deep close to the cliffs. We found the strait, says the first narrator, to have many turnings, and, as it were, shuttings up, as if there were no passage at all. Drake passed through the tortuous strait in 17 days. Clift, one of the historians of the expedition, whose narrative is preserved in Hakluyt's collection of voyages, says of the penguins there, 3,000 of which were killed in less than a day, we victualized ourselves with a kind of fowl, which is plentiful on that isle, St. George's in the Straits, and whose flesh is not unlike a fat goose here in England. They have no wings, but short pinions, which serve their turn in swimming. Their color is somewhat black, mixed with white spots under their belly and about their necks. They wall so upright that afar off a man would take them to be little children. If a man approach anything near them, they run into holes in the ground, which be not very deep, whereof the island is full, so that to take them we had staves with hooks fast to the end, wherewith some of our men pulled them out, and others being ready with cudgels did knock them on the head, for they bite so cruelly with their crooked bills that none of us were able to handle them alive. Drake's vessels, separated by a gale, were driven hither and thither. One of them, the Marigold, must have foundered, as she was never again heard of. The two remaining ships sought shelter in a dangerous rocky bay, from which the Golden Hind was driven to sea, her cable having parted. The other vessel, under Captain Winter's command, regained the straits, and anchoring there in an open bay, made great fires on the shore, that if Drake should put into the strait also, he might discover them. Winter proceeded later up the straits, and anchored in a sound, which he named the Port of Health, because his men, who had been very sick with long watching, wet, cold, and evil diet, soon recovered on the nourishing shellfish found there. He, after waiting some time and despairing of regaining Drake's company, gave over the voyage and set sail for England, where he arrived with reproach of having abandoned his commander. Drake now reduced to his own vessel, the Golden Hind, which was obliged to seek shelter on the coast of Terra del Fuego. The winds again forced him from his anchorage, and his shallop, with 8 men on board and provisions for only 1 day, was separated from him. The fate of these poor fellows was tragical. They regained the straits, where they caught and salted a quantity of penguins, and then coasted up South America to the Plata. 6 of them landed, and while searching for food in the forests, encountered a party of Indians, who wounded all of them with their arrows, and secured 4, pursuing the others to the boat. These latter reached the 2 men in charge, but before they could be put off, all were wounded by the natives. They, however, succeeded in reaching an island some distance from the mainland, where 2 of them died from the injuries received, and the boat was wrecked and beaten to pieces on the rocks. The remaining 2 stopped on the island 8 weeks, living on shellfish and a fruit resembling an orange, but could find no water. They at length ventured to the mainland on a large plank some 10 feet in length, which they propelled with paddles. The passage occupied 3 days. On coming to land, says Carter, the only survivor, we found a rivulet of sweet water, when William Pitcher, my only comfort and companion, although I endeavored to dissuade him, overdrank himself, and to my unspeakable grief died within half an hour. Carter himself fell into the hands of some Indians, who took pity on him and conducted him to a Portuguese settlement. 9 years elapsed before he was able to regain his own country. Meantime, Drake was driven so far to the southward that at length he fell in with the utmost part of the land towards the South Pole, or in other words, reached Cape Horn. The storm had lasted with little intermission for over 7 weeks. Drake went ashore, and sailor-like, leaning over a promontory, as far as he safely could, came back and told his people how that he had been farther south than any other man living. At last the wind was favorable, and he coasted northward, along the American shore, till he reached the island of Mocha, where the Indians appeared at first to be friendly, and bought off potatoes, roots, and 2 fat sheep, for which they received recompense. But on landing for the purpose of watering the ship, the natives shot at them, wounding every one of 12 men and Drake himself under the right eye. In this case no attempt was made at retaliation. The Indians doubtless took them for Spaniards. Drake, continuing his voyage, fell in with an Indian fishing from a canoe, who was made to understand their want of provisions, and was sent ashore with presents. This brought off a number of natives with supplies of poultry, hogs, and fruits, while Felipe, one of them who spoke Spanish, informed Drake that they had passed the fort of Valparaiso, then an insignificant settlement of less than a dozen Spanish families, where a large ship was lying at anchor. Felipe piloted them thither, and they soon discovered the ship, with a meager crew of 8 Spaniards and 4 Negroes on board. So little was an enemy expected that as Drake's vessel approached it was saluted with beat of drum, and a jar of Chili wine made ready for a hospitable reception. But Drake and his men wanted something more than bumpers of wine, and soon boarded the vessel, one of the men striking down the first Spaniard he met, and exclaiming, "Abaxo, perro!" "Down, dog!" Another of the crew leaped overboard, and swam ashore to give an alarm to the town. The rest were soon secured under hatches. The inhabitants of the town fled incontinently, but the spoils secured there was small. The chapel was rifled of its altar cloth, silver chalice, and other articles, which were handed over to Drake's chaplain. Quantities of wine and other provisions were secured. The crew of the prize, with the exception of the Greek pilot, were set ashore, and Drake left with his new acquisition, which, then examined at sea, was found to contain 1,770 jars of wine, 60,000 pieces of gold, some pearls, and other articles of value. The Indian who had guided them to this piece of good fortune was liberally rewarded. At a place called Tarapaca, whither they had come to water the ship, they found a Spaniard lying asleep, and keeping very bad guard over 13 bars of silver worth 4,000 ducats. Drake determined to take care of it for him. At a short distance off they encountered another, who, with an Indian, was driving 8 llamas, each carrying 100 weight of silver. It is needless to say that the llamas were conveyed on board, plus the silver. At Arica, 2 ships were found at anchor, one of which yielded 40 bars of silver, and the other a considerable quantity of wine. But these were as trifles to that which followed. Drake had pursued a leisurely course, but in spite of this fact, no intelligence of the pirates' approach had reached Lima. The term pirate is used advisedly, for whatever the gain to geographical science afforded by his voyages, their chief aim was spoil, and it mattered nothing whether England was at war with the victims of his prowess or not. A few leagues off Callao Harbor, the port of Lima, Drake boarded a Portuguese vessel. The owner agreed to pilot him into Callao, provided his cargo was left him. They arrived at nightfall, sailing in between all the ships that lay there, 17 in number, most of which had their sails ashore, for the Spaniards had as yet no enemies in those waters. They rifled the ships of their valuables, and these included a large quantity of silk and linen, and 1 chest of silver reels. But they heard that which made their ears tingle, and inflamed their desires for gain. The Cacafuego, a great treasure ship, had sailed only a few days before for a neighboring port. Drake immediately cut the cables of the ships at Lima and let them drive, that they might not pursue him. While he was thus employed, a vessel from Panama, laden with Spanish goods, entered the harbor, and anchored close by the Golden Hind. A boat came from the shore to search it, but because it was night they deferred the search till the morning, and only sent a man on board. The boat then came alongside Drake's vessel, and asked what ship it was. A Spanish prisoner answered, as he was ordered, that it was Miguel Angels from Chile. Satisfied with this, the officer in the boat sent a man to board it, but he, when on the point of entering, perceived one of the large guns, and retreated in the boat with all celerity, because no vessels that frequented that port and navigated those seas carried great shot. The crew of the Panama ship took alarm when they observed the rapid flight of the man, and put to sea. The Hind followed her, and the Spanish crew abandoned their ship and escaped ashore in their boat. The alarm had now been given in Lima, and the viceroy dispatched 2 vessels in pursuit, each having 200 men on board, but no artillery. The Spanish commander, however, showed no desire to tackle Drake, and he escaped, taking shortly afterwards 3 tolerable prizes, one of which yielded 40 bars of silver, 80 pounds weight of gold, and a golden crucifix set with goodly great emeralds. One of the men, having secreted 2 plates of gold from this prize and denied the theft, was immediately hanged. But it was the Cacafuego that Drake wanted, and after crossing the line he promised to give his own chain of gold to the first man who should descry her. On St. David's Day, the coveted prize was discovered from the top by a namesake of the commander, one John Drake. All sail was set, but an easy capture was before them, for the Spanish captain, not dreaming of enemies in those latitudes, slackened sail, in order to find out what ship she was. When they had approached near enough, Drake hailed them to strike, which being refused, with a great piece he shot her mast overboard, and having wounded the master with an arrow, the ship yielded. Having taken possession, the vessels sailed in company far out to sea, when they stopped and lay by. She proved a prize indeed, gold and silver in coin and bars, jewels and precious stones amounting to 360,000 pieces of gold were taken from her. The silver alone amounted to a value in our money of £212,000. It is stated that Drake called for the register of the treasure on board and wrote a receipt for the amount. The ship was dismissed, and Drake gave the captain a letter of safe conduct in case she should fall in with his consorts. This, as we know, was impossible. End of Chapter 16, Part 2. Chapter 16, Part 3 of The Sea, Its Stirring Story of Adventure, Peril, and Heroism, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Sea, Its Stirring Story of Adventure, Peril, and Heroism, Volume 1, by Frederick WHYMPER. Chapter 16, The History of Ships and Shipping Interests, Continued, Part 3. Drake's plain course now was to make his way home, and he wisely argued that it would be unsafe to attempt the voyage by the route he had come, as the Spaniards would surely attack him in full force, the whole coast of Chile and Peru being aroused to action. He conceived the bold notion of rounding North America. In other words, he proposed to make that passage which has been the great dream of Arctic explorers, and which has only, as we shall hereafter see, been once made, and that in a very partial sense, by Franklin and McClure. His company agreed to his views. Firstly, to refit, water, and provision the ship in some convenient bay. Thenceforward, says one of them, to hasten on our intended journey for the discovery of the said passage, through which we might with joy return to our longed homes. They sailed for Nicaragua, near the mainland of which they found a small island with a suitable bay, where they obtained wood, water, and fish. A small prize was taken while there. Having on board a cargo of sarsaparilla, which they disdained, and butter and honey, which they appropriated, Drake now sailed northward, and most undoubtedly reached the Grand Bay of San Francisco. Californian authorities concede this. The Drake's Bay of the charts is an open roadstead, and does not answer the descriptions given of the great navigator's visit. He had peaceful interviews with the natives, and took possession, in the fashion of those days, of the country, setting up a monument of the Queen's right and title to the same, namely, a plate nailed upon a fair great post, whereupon was engraven Her Majesty's name, the day and year of our arrival there, together with Her Highness's picture, and arms in a piece of sixpence of current English money under the plate, whereunder also was written the name of our general. History does not tell us the fate of that sixpence, but the title, New Albion, bestowed on the country by Drake, remained on the maps halfway into this century, or just before the discovery of gold in California. The natives regarded the English with superstitious awe, and could not be prevented from offering them sacrifices, with lamentable weeping, scratching, and tearing the flesh from their faces with their nails, whereof issued abundance of blood. But we used, says the narrator quoted by Hakluyt, signs to them of disliking this, and stayed their hands from force, and directed them upwards to the living God, whom only they ought to worship. After remaining there 5 weeks, Drake took his departure, and the natives watched the ships sadly as they sailed, and kept fires burning on the hilltops as long as they continued in sight. Good store of seals and birds were taken from the Farallone Islands. Many an egg has the writer eaten, laid by the descendants of those very birds. They are supplied in quantities to the San Francisco markets. Drake's attempt at the northern passage was now abandoned. 68 days was Drake's ship, containing one of the most valuable freights ever held in one bottom, in the open sea, during which time no land was sighted. At the end of this period, the Pelew, Philippine, and Molucca Islands were successively reached. At Ternate, Drake sent a velvet cloak as a present to the king, requesting provisions, and that he might be allowed to trade for spices. The king was amiable and well disposed. He sent before him 4 great and large canoes, in every one whereof were certain of his greatest states that were about him, attired in white lawn of cloth of calicut, having over their heads, from the one end of the canoe to the other, a covering of thin perfumed mats, borne up with a frame made of reeds for the same use, under which every one did sit in his order, according to his dignity, to keep him from the heat of the sun. The rest were soldiers, which stood in comely order, round about on both sides, without whom sat the rowers in certain galleries, which being 3 on a side all along the canoes, did lie off from the side thereof 3 or 4 yards, one being orderly builded lower than another, in every of which galleries were 80 rowers. These canoes were furnished with warlike munitions, every man, for the most part, having his sword and target, with his dagger, besides other weapons, as lances, calivers, darts, bows, and arrows. Also every canoe had a small cast base, or cannon, mounted at the least 1 full yard upon a stock set upright. These canoes or galleys were rowed about the ship, those on board doing homage as they passed. The king soon arrived in state, and was received with a salute of great guns, with trumpets sounding, and such politic display of state and strength as Drake knew it was advisable to exhibit. Many presents were made to the king, who in return sent off provisions of rice, fowls, fruits, sugar-cane, and imperfect and liquid sugar, presumably molasses. Next day there was a grand reception ashore. The king, covered with gold and jewels, under a rich canopy embossed with gold, professing great friendship. The fact was that his own father had been assassinated by the Portuguese, and he himself had besieged and taken their Fort St. Paul's, and compelled them to leave it. He was doubtless anxious for some alliance, which might strengthen his hands against the Portuguese. Drake, however, had no commission, nor desire at that time to engage his country to any such treaty. His principal object now was to get home safely with his treasure. He, however, successfully traded for a quantity of cloves and provisions. Off Celebes, the Hind became entangled among the shoals, and while running under full sail, suddenly struck on a rock, where she stuck fast. Boats were got out to see whether an anchor might not be employed to draw the ship off, but the water all around was very deep, no bottom being found. 3 tons of cloves, 8 guns, and certain stores were thrown overboard, but to no purpose. Fuller says quaintly that they threw overboard as much wealth as would break the heart of a miser to think on't, with much sugar and packs of spices, making a caudle of the sea round about. Then they betook themselves to their prayers, the best lever at such a dead lift indeed, and it pleased God that the wind, formerly their mortal enemy, became their friend. To the joy of all, the Hind glided off the rocks, and almost uninjured. On the way home they visited Barateva, Java, the Cape, and Sierra Leone, being singularly fortunate in avoiding the Portuguese and Spanish ships. The Hind arrived safely at Plymouth on September 26th, having been nearly 3 years on her eventful voyage. Drake was received with great honor, and was knighted by the Queen. She gave orders that his little ship should be laid up at Deptford, and there carefully preserved as a monument of the most remarkable voyage yet made. Elizabeth honored Drake by banqueting on board, and his fame spread everywhere through the kingdom. the boys of Westminster School set up Latin verses on the mainmast, of which Southey gives the following free translation. On Hercules' pillars, Drake, thou mayest plus ultra write full well, and say, I will in greatness that great Hercules excel. And again, Sir Drake, whom well the world's end knows, which thou didst compass round, and whom both poles of heaven once saw, which north and south do bound. The stars above will make thee known, if men here silent were, the sun himself cannot forget his fellow traveller. Drake's series of victories over the Spaniards, and the repulse which occurred just before his death, are details of history which would fill a volume. He received a sailor's funeral at Portobello, his body being committed to the deep in a leaden coffin, with the solemn service of the English Church, rendered more impressive by volleys of musketry and the bombing of guns from all the fleet. A poet of the day says, the waves became his winding sheet, the waters were his tomb, but for his fame the ocean sea was not sufficient room. No single name in naval history has ever attained the celebrity acquired by Drake. The Spaniards who called him a dragon believed that he had dealings with the devil. That notion, says Southey, prevented them from feeling any mortification at his successes, and it enhanced their exultation over the failure of his last expedition, which they considered as a triumph of their religion over heresy and magic. The common people in England itself, more especially in the western counties, believed any quantity of fables concerning him, some of them verging on childishness. He had only to cast a chip in the water when it would become a fine vessel. It was not by his skill as an engineer and the munificent expenditure of the wealth which he had so daringly obtained that Drake supplied Plymouth with fresh water, but by mounting his horse, riding about Dartmoor till he came to a spring sufficiently copious for his design, then wheeling round, pronouncing some magical words, and galloping back into the town with the stream in full flow, and forming its own channel at the horse's heels. One of the popular stories regarding him is briefly as follows. When Sir Francis left on one of his long voyages, he told his wife that he should not return within a certain number of years. She might conclude that he was dead, and might, if she so chose, wed again. One version places the time at 7, and another at 10 years. During these long years, the excellent lady remained true to her lord, but at the end of the term accepted an offer. One of Drake's ministering spirits, whose charge it was to convey to him any intelligence in which he was nearly concerned, brought him the tidings. Immediately he loaded one of his great guns and fired it right through the globe on one side and up on the other, with so true an aim that it made its way into the church, between the two parties most concerned, just as the marriage service was beginning. "It comes from Drake," cried the wife to the now unbrided bridegroom. "He is alive, and there must be neither troth nor ring between thee and me." Drake is described as of low stature, but well set, and of an admirable presence. His chest was broad, his hair nut brown, his beard handsome and full, his head remarkably round, his eyes large and clear, his countenance fresh, cheerful, and engaging. It has been said of him that he was a willing hearer of every man's opinion, but commonly a follower of his own, which as a rule was really sure to be judicious. He had a quick temper, and once offended was hard to be reconciled, but his friendships were firm. He was ambitious to the last degree, and the vanity which usually accompanies that sin laid him open to flattery. He was affable with his men, who idolized him as the grand commander and skillful seaman that he most undoubtedly was. In spite of the rich prizes so often taken, a competent authority says, The expeditions undertaken in Elizabeth's reign against the Spaniards are said to have produced no advantage to England in any degree commensurate with the cost of money and expense of life with which they were performed. But we must never forget the wonderful development of the Navy which resulted, the splendid training acquired by our sailors, and the grand gains to geographical science. The opening of colonization and trade with America, so far as England is concerned, is due to Sir Humphrey Gilbert and his stepbrother, Sir Walter Raleigh. From their comparatively insignificant attempts at settling parts of that vast northern continent, what grand results have accrued! The acorn has become a mighty, wide-spreading oak, sheltering the representatives of every nationality. When Sir Humphrey Gilbert proposed to Queen Elizabeth the settlement of a colony in the New World, she immediately assented, and granted him letters patent as comprehensive and wide-spreading as ever issued by papal sanction. She accorded free liberty to him, his heirs, and assigns forever, to discover and take possession of any heathen and savage lands not being actually possessed by any Christian prince or people. Such countries and all towns, castles, or villages, to be holden by them of the crown, payment of the fifth of all the gold and silver ore discovered being required by the latter. The privileges seemed so great that very many gentlemen of good estimation drew unto Sir Humphrey to associate with him in so commendable an enterprise. But divisions and feuds arose, and Gilbert went to sea only to become involved in a dangerous sea fight, in which many of his company were slain, and his ships were battered and disabled. He was compelled to put back with the loss of a tall ship. The records of this encounter are meager, but the disaster retarded for the time his attempt at colonization, besides impairing his estate. Sir Humphrey's patent was only for 6 years, unless he succeeded in his project, and in 1583 he found means to equip a second expedition, to which Raleigh contributed a bark of 200 tons, named after him, the little fleet numbering in all 5 vessels. The Queen had always favored Gilbert, and before he departed on this voyage sent him a golden anchor with a large pearl on it, by the hands of Raleigh. In the letter accompanying it, Raleigh wrote, "Brother, I have sent you a token from Her Majesty, an anchor guided by a lady, as you see. And further, Her Highness willed me to send you word that she wished you as great a good hap and safety to your ship as if she herself were there in person, desiring you to have care of yourself as of that which she tendereth, and therefore, for her sake, you must provide for it accordingly. Further, she commandeth that you leave your picture with me." Elizabeth's direct interest in the rapidly increasing maritime and commercial interests of the day was very apparent in all her actions. Bark Raleigh was the largest vessel of the expedition, 2 of the others being of 40 and one of 20 tons only. The number of those who embarked was about 260, and the list included carpenters, shipwrights, masons, and smiths, also mineral men and refiners. It is admitted that among them there were many who had been taken as pirates in the narrow seas, instead of being hanged according to their deserts. "For solace of our people," says one of the captains under Gilbert, "and allurement of the savages, we were provided of music in good variety, not omitting the least toys, as morris dancers, hobby-horse, and May-like conceits to delight the savage people, whom we intended to win by all fair means possible." The period of starting being somewhat late in the season, it was determined to sail first for Newfoundland instead of Cape Florida, as at the former Gilbert knew that he could obtain abundant supplies from the numerous ships employed in the abundant cod fisheries. The voyage was to commence in disaster. They sailed on June 11th, and 2 days later the men of the bark Raleigh hailed their companions with the information that their captain and many on board were grievously sick. She left them that night and put back to Plymouth, where, it is stated, she arrived with a number of the crew prostrated by a contagious disease. Some mystery attaches to this defection. The others proceeded on their way, not a little grieved with the loss of the most puissant ship in their fleet. 2 of the fleet parted company in fog. One of them was found in the Bay of Conception, her men in new apparel, and particularly well provided, the secret being that they had boarded an unfortunate Newfoundland ship on the way, and had pretty well rifled it, not even stopping at torture where the wretched sailors had objected to be stripped of their possessions. The other vessel was found lying off the harbor of St. John's, where at first the English merchants objected to Gilbert's entry, till he assured them that he came with a commission from Her Majesty, and had no ill intent. On the way in, his vessel struck on a rock, whereupon the other captains sent to the rescue, saved the ship, and fired a salute in his honor. His first act was to tax all the ships for his own supply. The Portuguese, in particular, contributed liberally, so that the crews were presented above their allowances with wines, marmalades, most fine rusk or biscuit, sweet oil, and sundry delicacies. Then the merchants and masters were assembled to hear his commission read, and possession of the harbor and country for 200 leagues every way was taken in the name of the Queen. A wooden pillar was erected on the spot, and the arms of England, engraved on lead, were affixed. The lands lying on the water side were granted to certain of the adventurers and merchants, they covenanting to pay rent and service to Gilbert, his heirs and assigns forever. Some of the before-mentioned pirates of the expedition gave Sir Humphrey a considerable amount of trouble while at St. John's, some deserting, and others plotting to steal away the ship by night. A number of them stole a ship laden with fish, setting the crew on shore. When ready to sail, he found that there were not sufficient hands for all his vessels, and the Swallow was left for the purpose of transporting home a number of the sick. He selected for himself the smallest of his fleet, the Squirrel, described as a frigate of 10 tons, as most suitable for exploring the coasts. But that which made him of good heart was a sample of silver ore which one of his miners had discovered. He doubted not to borrow 10,000 pounds of the Queen for his next voyage upon the credit of this mine. For 8 days they followed the coast towards Cape Breton, at the end of which time the wind rose, bringing thick fog and rain so that they could not see a cable's length before them. They were driven among shoals and breakers, and their largest ship was wrecked in a moment. They and the other vessel, says Hayes, saw her strike, and her stern presently beaten to pieces, whereupon the frigate in which was the general, and the Golden Hind cast about, even for our lives, into the wind's eye, because that way carried us to the seaward. Making out from this danger, we sounded one while 7 fathoms, then 5, then 4, and less, again deeper, immediately 4 fathom, then but 3, the sea going mightily and high. At last we recovered, God be thanked, in some despair, to sea room enough. All that day and part of the night we beat up and down as near unto the wreck as was possible, but all in vain. This was a heavy and grievous event to lose our chief ship, freighted with great provision, but worse was the loss of our men, to the number of almost 100 souls, amongst whom was drowned a learned man, a Hungarian, born in the city of Buda, called thereof Budæus, who out of piety and zeal to good attempts adventured in this action, minding to record in the Latin tongue the jests of things worthy of remembrance happening in this discovery, to the honor of our nation. Here also perished our Saxon refiner and discoverer of inestimable riches. Maurice Brown, the captain, when advised to shift for his life in the pinnace, refused to quit the ship, lest it should be thought to have been lost through his default. With this mind he mounted upon the highest deck, where he attended imminent death and unavoidable, how long I leave it to God, who withdraweth not his comfort from his servants at such a time. Of the company only 10 were saved in a small pinnace which was piloted to Newfoundland. Meantime, on board the remaining vessels there was much suffering, and Sir Humphrey was obliged to yield to the general desire and sail for England, having compassion upon his poor men, in whom he saw no lack of goodwill, but of means fit to perform the action they came for. He promised his subordinate officers to set them forth royally the next spring, if God should spare them, but it was not so to be. Sir Humphrey Gilbert was entreated, when one day he had come on board the Hind, to remain there, instead of risking himself in the frigate, which was overcharged with nettage and small artillery, to which he answered, "I will not forsake my little company going homewards, with whom I have passed so many storms and perils." A short time afterwards, while experiencing foul weather and terrible seas, breaking short and high, pyramid-wise, men which all their life had occupied the sea never saw it more outrageous, the frigate was nearly engulfed, but recovered. Gilbert, sitting abaft with a book in his hand, cried out to the crew of the Hind in the following noble words, so often since recorded in poetry and prose: "Courage, my lads! We are as near to heaven by sea as by land." That same night the lights of the little vessel were suddenly missed, and Gilbert and his gallant men were engulfed in the depths forever. Of such men we may appropriately say with the poet Campbell, "The deck it was their field of fame, and ocean was their grave." The Hind reached Falmouth in safety, though sadly shattered and torn. But the spirit of enterprise then prevailing was not to be easily quashed, and only a few months after the failure of poor Gilbert's enterprise, we find Sir Walter Raleigh in the field. He obtained letters of patent similar to those before mentioned, and was aided by several persons of wealth, particularly Sir Richard Greenville and Mr. William Saunderson. 2 barks under Captains Amadas and Barlow were sent to a part of the American continent north of the Gulf of Florida, and after skirting the coast for 120 miles, a suitable haven was found, the land round which was immediately taken for the Queen with the usual formalities. After sundry minor explorations, they returned to England, where they gave a glowing account of the country. It was so full of grapes that the very beating and surge of the seas overflowed them. The vegetation was so rich and abundant that one of the captains thought that in all the world the like abundance is not to be found, while the woods were full of deer and smaller game. The cedars were the highest and reddest in the world, while among smaller trees was that bearing the rind of black cinnamon. The inhabitants were kind and gentle and void of treason, handsome and goodly people in their behavior, as mannerly and civil as any of Europe. It is true that they had a moral malice against a certain neighboring nation, that their wars were very cruel and bloody, and that by reason thereof, and of civil dissensions which had happened of late years amongst them, the people were marvellously wasted, and in some places the country left desolate. These little discrepancies were passed over, and Elizabeth was so well pleased with the accounts brought home that she named the country Virginia, not merely because it was discovered in the reign of a virgin queen, but because it did still seem to retain the virgin purity and plenty of the first creation, and the people there primitive innocence. These happy natives were described as living after the manner of the golden age, as free from toil, spending their time in fishing, fowling, and hunting, and gathering the fruits of the earth, which ripened without their care. They had no boundaries to their lands, nor individual property in cattle, but shared and shared alike. All this, which was rather too good to be absolutely true, seems to have been implicitly believed. The letters of patent, however, granted to poor Sir Humphrey Gilbert and subsequently to Sir Walter Raleigh, marked a most important epoch in the world's history. For, from those small starting points, date the English efforts at colonizing America, the great new world of the past, the present, and the future. Where then a few naked savages lurked and lazed, fished and hunted, 40 millions of English-speaking people now dwell, whose interests on and about the sea, rising in importance every day, are scarcely excelled by those of any nation on the globe, except our own. Some points in connection with this colonization, bearing as they do on the history of the sea and maritime affairs, will be treated in the succeeding volume. The reader, who while living at home in ease, has voyaged in spirit with the writer over so much of the globe's watery surface, visiting its most distant shores, will not be one of those who underrate the dangers of the seas. Nor will current events allow us to forget them. The many voices of ocean, as Michelet puts it, its murmur and its menace, its thunder and its roar, its wail, its sigh, rise from the watery graves of 600 brave men, who but a few weeks ago formed the bulk of two crews, the one of a noble English frigate, the other a splendid German ironclad, both lost within sight of our own shores. Early in this volume, wooden walls were compared with armored vessels, and we are painfully reminded by the loss of both the Eurydice and Grosse Kerfist how unsettled is the question in its practical bearings. Its discussion must be resumed as a part of the history of ships and shipping in the ensuing volume. Till then, kind reader, adieu. End of Chapter 16. End of Volume 1. End of the Sea, its stirring story of adventure, peril, and heroism, Volume 1, by Frederick WHYMPER.